A king's name survives, but his kingdom does not. A city appears in records, then slips beyond every confirmed location. A weapon rests where no battle belongs. A burial raises questions centuries cannot silence. Time preserves fragments, not explanations. 3 hours begin here, where evidence whispers and logic starts losing its shape. Far beyond the great royal centers of the ancient Near East, the landscape of northern Mesopotamia stretches beneath a wide sky, marked by low hills, fertile plains, and the remains of settlements that once belonged to powerful kingdoms. Somewhere within this broad region stood Waššukanni, the royal capital of the Mitanni kingdom. Its name survives in cuneiform records, its kings appear in diplomatic correspondence, and its political importance is beyond dispute. Yet, the physical location of the city remains uncertain. Waššukanni flourished during the 2nd millennium BC, when the Mitanni kingdom emerged as a major power between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. From roughly the 16th to the 14th centuries BC, Mitanni rulers controlled territory across parts of northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia, maintaining relationships with Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, and Assyria. Egyptian records even preserve the names of Mitanni kings and describe diplomatic exchanges between the two courts. But when historians search for the capital itself, the evidence becomes remarkably elusive. Ancient texts indicate that Waššukanni was more than a ceremonial residence. It functioned as the political heart of Mitanni authority, a place from which kings governed territory, received foreign envoys, and managed a sophisticated network of alliances. Yet no archaeological site has been universally accepted as its remains. One of the leading candidates is Tel Fekeriye, located in northeastern Syria near the modern Turkish border. Excavations there revealed a substantial settlement with connections to the political world of the 2nd millennium BC. A famous bilingual statue discovered at the site, written in Akkadian and Aramaic, later became especially important for understanding the region. The location also fits certain geographical expectations for a Mitanni center. Yet, fitting the geography is not the same as proving the identification. Other possibilities have been proposed, including sites farther west or south, reflecting different interpretations of ancient geographical descriptions and political boundaries. The problem is compounded by the limited archaeological visibility of the Mitanni kingdom itself. Later settlements occupied many of the same landscapes, altering or burying earlier remains. Political centers could be rebuilt, dismantled, or absorbed into new urban communities, leaving little that can be confidently attributed to a particular royal capital. Written evidence provides another layer of uncertainty. Hittite documents refer to Waššukanni in connection with the Mitanni rulers, while Egyptian correspondence places the kingdom within a broad diplomatic world extending from the Nile Valley toward northern Syria. Assyrian sources also preserve fragments of the kingdom's later history. But these texts were written for political purposes, and ancient geographical descriptions rarely provide the kind of precise coordinates modern researchers would need. Could Waššukanni lie beneath a known settlement whose deeper layers remain inaccessible? Could centuries of rebuilding have erased the architectural signature of the Mitanni court? Or might the capital have occupied a location that has not yet received the archaeological attention necessary to reveal its identity? More speculative interpretations have occasionally placed the city in different parts of Upper Mesopotamia, sometimes relying on linguistic clues, ancient place names, or reconstructions of regional trade routes. These proposals remain debated because the surviving evidence is fragmentary, and similar geographical names can belong to different periods or locations. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Waššukanni is that its existence is not in doubt. The city was real. Its rulers were real. Its diplomatic relationships were documented. What remains uncertain is the ground beneath which its physical traces lie. Somewhere in the landscapes once controlled by Mitanni, there may still be foundations, administrative tablets, royal objects, or architectural remains capable of settling the debate. Until such evidence is found and securely connected to the written record, Waššukanni remains one of the great unresolved locations of the ancient Near East, a capital known by name, remembered by rival kingdoms, yet still waiting to be placed with confidence on the archaeological map. And from the uncertain location of Waššukanni, the trail leads farther east, toward a kingdom known through the records of others but still difficult to place securely on the map. The name is Marhashi, a powerful land mentioned in Mesopotamian texts, remembered for its wealth, its rulers, and its encounters with some of the greatest powers of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Picture the eastern edge of the ancient Iranian world. Rugged mountains rising beyond broad valleys, routes threading through difficult terrain, and caravans carrying metals, stones, textiles, and other valuable goods between Mesopotamia and regions farther east. Somewhere within this immense landscape was Marhashi. Its precise location, however, remains one of the enduring problems of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. The kingdom first becomes visible through the written records of Mesopotamia. During the reign of the Akkadian king Sargon, around the 24th century BC, eastern lands were drawn into a rapidly expanding political network. Later, Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin recorded military campaigns that reached into regions associated with Marhashi. These references suggest that the kingdom was not an insignificant frontier community. It possessed enough political organization and resources to attract the attention of rulers governing one of the ancient world's most powerful states. Centuries later, Marhashi continued to appear in Mesopotamian records. The rulers of the Ur-III dynasty maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with eastern territories, and texts mention Marhashi in connection with tribute, trade, and political exchange. Its name therefore survived across generations, even as the political landscape around it changed. But where was it? This is where the historical trail begins to thin. Most researchers place Marhashi somewhere in southeastern Iran, perhaps within or near the broader region of ancient Elam. Some evidence points toward the mountainous zones east of Mesopotamia, while other interpretations suggest a position farther south or southeast. The difficulty lies in the nature of the surviving evidence. Mesopotamian scribes frequently describe distant territories from their own political perspective, and ancient geographical terminology does not always correspond neatly with modern borders or place names. Archaeology has provided possible clues, but no universally accepted site has emerged as Marhashi's capital. One important possibility is that the kingdom should not be associated with a single monumental city in the way we might associate Egypt with Memphis or Babylon, with its famous urban center. Marhashi may have consisted of several interconnected settlements controlled by a regional ruling dynasty. If so, identifying the kingdom through one archaeological site could be far more difficult than expected. There is also the question of its relationship with neighboring Elam. Some historical interpretations have treated Marhashi as a distinct eastern power, while others have emphasized its close connections with Elamite political networks. Ancient sources themselves do not always provide enough information to separate these relationships with confidence. Even the identity of its rulers comes to us through foreign records. Kings associated with Marhashi appear in Mesopotamian inscriptions, yet their own archives have not been recovered in sufficient quantity to reconstruct their kingdom from an internal perspective. We know how Mesopotamian kings described Marhashi, but what did the people of Marhashi call their own land? How did they understand their political identity? Which city served as their principal center? More speculative theories have attempted to connect Marhashi with archaeological cultures farther east, sometimes using similarities in material remains, trade goods, or geographical patterns as supporting evidence. These proposals remain uncertain because similarities between neighboring cultures do not necessarily establish political identity. Perhaps the greatest clue lies in the repeated attention Mesopotamian rulers gave to this distant kingdom. Marhashi was remembered because it mattered. Its rulers participated in networks that stretched across thousands of kilometers, connecting Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau and regions beyond. Yet, the physical landscape of Marhashi remains elusive. A kingdom recorded by kings, traders, and scribes survives in the historical record, while its cities remain uncertain. Somewhere among the valleys and mountains of southeastern Iran may lie evidence capable of transforming these scattered references into a recognizable political landscape. Until that evidence emerges, Marhashi remains a kingdom known through echoes, powerful enough to enter the records of great empires, yet still waiting for archaeology to reveal where its story truly unfolded. From the uncertain kingdom of Marhashi, the trail moves farther into the eastern reaches of the ancient world, where Mesopotamian scribes recorded names belonging to distant lands they knew largely through trade, diplomacy, and warfare. Among them was Tukrish, a place mentioned in cuneiform texts associated with valuable resources and distant rulers, yet still difficult to anchor securely on a modern map. Picture the highlands east of Mesopotamia, where mountain passes connect lowland cities with remote valleys. These routes were more than geographical corridors. They carried tin, metals, stone, livestock, textiles, and ideas between communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. Somewhere within this vast eastern sphere lay the land the Mesopotamians called Tukrish. Its importance becomes visible in the records of the Akkadian period, particularly during the reign of Naram-Sin in the 23rd century BC. Mesopotamian inscriptions describe contacts between the Akkadian state and eastern territories, including Tukrish. The references suggest a region sufficiently distant to be regarded as part of the wider eastern frontier, yet important enough to appear within the political vocabulary of one of Mesopotamia's most ambitious rulers. One intriguing reference associates Tukrish with a ruler described as coming from that land. The appearance of a named foreign king suggests that Tukrish may have possessed an organized political structure, rather than being merely a geographical region. But the evidence becomes difficult when researchers attempt to locate it. Most interpretations place Tukrish somewhere in the Iranian highlands, or in regions farther northeast of Mesopotamia. Some scholars have connected the name with areas of the central or eastern Iranian plateau, while others have proposed locations farther north. The problem is that ancient geographical names were not necessarily fixed. A term used by Mesopotamian scribes could describe a political territory, a broader cultural region, or a place known primarily through its trade connections. Could Tukrish have occupied a mountain kingdom whose settlements were dispersed across valleys rather than concentrated around a single monumental capital? Such a possibility would help explain why archaeology has struggled to identify it. The highlands of Iran contain countless settlements, many of which have been altered by later occupation, erosion, agriculture, and changing river systems. A political center that flourished more than 4,000 years ago may no longer resemble the landscape described by Mesopotamian scribes. There is also another complication. Mesopotamia was deeply dependent on Eastern trade networks. Certain materials, particularly metals and valuable stones, traveled enormous distances before reaching the great cities of southern Mesopotamia. Tukrish may therefore have been remembered not because its political influence extended directly into Mesopotamia, but because it occupied an important position along these long-distance routes. Later interpretations have sometimes attempted to associate Tukrish with known archaeological cultures of the Iranian plateau. Similar pottery traditions, metalworking techniques, or patterns of settlement have been used to suggest possible connections. Yet, material similarities alone cannot establish that a particular archaeological culture was the people known in cuneiform as Tukrish. More speculative proposals have pushed the location even farther east, sometimes linking Tukrish with regions approaching Central Asia. These ideas remain difficult to demonstrate, largely because the written references are too limited to provide a reliable chain of geographical evidence. Still, the name persists. Tukrish appears as a faint geographical marker in a world where political boundaries were constantly shifting. Its people may have traded with Mesopotamia, resisted its expansion, or simply existed beyond the reach of its armies. Perhaps its rulers controlled mountain passes that made distant commerce possible. Perhaps the land was never a unified kingdom in the modern sense at all. What remains is a handful of references pointing toward a substantial but poorly understood eastern region. Somewhere beyond the Mesopotamian plains, the landscapes associated with Tukrish may still contain settlements, burial grounds, workshops, or inscriptions capable of clarifying its identity. Until such evidence is securely connected to the ancient name, Tukrish remains suspended between text and terrain, a place remembered by scribes, yet still waiting for the landscape itself to reveal where that memory began. From the uncertain landscape of Tukrish, the trail now turns back toward the great alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, where rivers once shifted their courses across an immense world of mud, reeds, canals, and cultivated fields. Here, between the Tigris and Euphrates, another political power emerged whose name survives clearly in written records, while the location of its principal center remains far less certain: the Sealand Kingdom. Picture southern Mesopotamia during the centuries following the decline of Babylon's Old Babylonian dynasty. The political landscape was fragmented, and communities along the marshes and waterways gained new importance. In this environment, the Sealand rulers established a kingdom that controlled territory in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia, probably during the 18th and 17th centuries BC, with the dynasty continuing into later periods. The name itself is revealing. Ancient sources refer to the region as the Sealand, a watery frontier associated with marshes, river channels, and the northern reaches of the Persian Gulf. Its geography was never completely stable. Rivers changed course, sediments accumulated, coastlines shifted, and settlements could gradually become isolated from the waterways that had once sustained them. This unstable environment may be one reason the kingdom's principal capital has remained so elusive. Written sources identify rulers of the Sealand dynasty, including Illuma-Illum, Golkashar, Peshkal-Daramesh, and other kings who appear in later Babylonian traditions. Their existence is supported by cuneiform evidence, and some of their reigns can be placed within the broader chronology of Mesopotamian history. Yet, knowing the names of kings does not necessarily tell us where their palace stood. The most frequently discussed archaeological candidate is Tel Khaibar in southern Iraq. Excavations there revealed a substantial administrative building dating to the period traditionally associated with the Sealand dynasty. Cuneiform tablets discovered at the site have provided valuable evidence about administration, taxation, agriculture, and economic activity. Tel Khaibar is therefore an important window into the Sealand world. But is it the capital? That question remains open. The site appears to have been an important administrative center, but identifying it as the royal capital requires stronger evidence. No inscription has yet provided the decisive statement that would transform a plausible association into a secure identification. And the landscape itself makes the search unusually difficult. Southern Iraq has been shaped for thousands of years by the movement of rivers and the accumulation of sediment. Ancient settlements that once stood beside waterways may now lie far from their original channels. Some could have been buried beneath layers of alluvium, while others may have been damaged by erosion, agriculture, or modern development. There is another possibility. Perhaps the Sealand kingdom did not depend upon a single dominant capital in the way later Babylon did. A political authority operating within a marsh-rich environment might have relied upon several settlements, fortified administrative centers, and royal residences connected by waterways. If so, the search for one definitive capital may itself be based on assumptions that do not fit the political geography of the region. Later, Babylonian texts also preserve memories of the Sealand rulers, but these accounts were written after the kingdom's own period of power. They offer valuable historical clues while also reflecting the political concerns of later Mesopotamian dynasties. Could the capital therefore still lie beneath an unidentified mound in southern Iraq? Could a former river channel conceal the route that once connected a royal center to the Persian Gulf? Or might Tel Khyber eventually provide evidence strong enough to settle the question? For now, the Sealand kingdom remains an unusual case. Its rulers are known, its political existence is documented, and its administrative world is slowly emerging through archaeology. Yet, the precise location of its royal center remains uncertain. Somewhere within the changing waterways of southern Mesopotamia, the capital may still be waiting beneath accumulated earth and silt, leaving one final question suspended over the landscape. How much of the Sealand kingdom remains to be recovered before its lost center can finally be placed on the map? From the shifting waterways of the Sealand kingdom, the trail now moves northward, toward the broad plains of Upper Mesopotamia. Here, beneath the dry landscape of northeastern Syria, rises Tel Leilan, a vast archaeological mound whose layers preserve the remains of a city that once stood at the center of regional power. Its most compelling story, however, is written not only in what was built, but in what abruptly came to an end. Around 1800 BC, Tel Leilan was already an important settlement in the kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia. Under the rule of King Shamshi-Adad I, the city became known as Shubat-Enlil and served as a major administrative and political center. Royal officials managed agriculture, taxation, storage, and communication from the site, connecting the surrounding countryside to a wider state. For a time, the system appears to have functioned successfully. Then the evidence changes. Excavations have revealed that occupation at Tel Leilan was interrupted during the early 2nd millennium BC. Administrative activity declined, buildings were abandoned, and the city ceased to operate as the major political center it had once been. The transformation was not simply the gradual fading of a settlement. Archaeological evidence suggests a substantial disruption. But what caused it? One of the most compelling explanations involves climate. Scientific studies of ancient environmental conditions indicate that the region experienced a period of severe aridity around the time of Tel Leilan's decline. Soil deposits, botanical evidence, and regional climate records suggest that rainfall may have decreased significantly, placing enormous pressure on communities dependent upon agriculture. For a city whose economy relied heavily on grain production, such a change could have been devastating. Fields that had supported large populations would have become less productive. Harvests could have diminished. Food reserves would have been strained. Political authority, dependent upon taxation and redistribution, may then have weakened in parallel. Yet, climate alone may not tell the whole story. Tel Leilan was part of a complex political environment in which rival kingdoms competed for territory, trade routes, and agricultural resources. The city had experienced warfare before, and the wider region was frequently affected by political instability. A prolonged drought could have intensified existing tensions, transforming an environmental challenge into a broader political crisis. Archaeology offers several intriguing clues. At Tel Leilan, researchers discovered evidence of destruction and abandonment within the settlement. Buildings were left unused, and administrative activity appears to have collapsed. The evidence does not provide a single dramatic moment that can be identified with complete confidence as the city's final day. Instead, it presents a sequence of disruption, decline, and abandonment. This distinction matters. Ancient cities rarely disappear because of one isolated event. Drought, conflict, economic instability, disease, migration, and political fragmentation can interact in ways that make the final cause difficult to separate from the conditions that preceded it. Some interpretations have therefore suggested that the climatic episode may have acted as a catalyst rather than an independent explanation. A weakened agricultural system could have reduced the state's ability to supply officials and soldiers. Political authority may have fractured, while neighboring powers took advantage of the instability. More speculative interpretations have emphasized sudden environmental shocks or regional upheavals, but these remain difficult to establish. The archaeological record is incomplete, and evidence from one settlement cannot automatically explain developments across the entire Near East. What makes Tel Leilan especially compelling is the relationship between environmental evidence and written history. Here, archaeology allows researchers to compare physical remains with administrative records produced by people who actually lived through the period of political transformation. The city therefore becomes more than an abandoned mound. It becomes a record of how closely human societies can depend upon climate, agriculture, political organization, and the stability of surrounding regions. Yet, one question remains. Was Tel Leilan brought down primarily by a prolonged environmental crisis, by political conflict, or by the interaction of forces that no single explanation can capture? The answer may lie in evidence still buried within the settlement, waiting to reveal how a powerful city reached the point where its administrative halls fell silent, and its fields could no longer sustain the world that had been built around them. From the abandoned administrative center of Tel Leilan, the trail leads deeper into the political world of northern Mesopotamia, toward a kingdom whose rulers commanded armies, negotiated with Egypt, and challenged the ambitions of powerful neighbors. The Mitanni kingdom emerged during the second millennium BC, yet the origins of its ruling dynasty remain unusually difficult to reconstruct. Picture the upper valleys of the Euphrates and Khabur rivers, where fertile plains supported cities, villages, herds, and long-distance trade. During the 16th and 15th centuries BC, a new political power appeared across much of this region. Its rulers are known from Hittite, Egyptian, Assyrian, and Mesopotamian sources, but their own royal archives have largely escaped discovery. This creates an unusual historical problem. We know the dynasty existed. We know its kings maintained diplomatic relationships with some of the most influential courts of the ancient Near East. We even possess clues about their religious traditions and military culture. Yet, the process by which this dynasty first gained power remains uncertain. The earliest stages are particularly difficult. The Mitanni kingdom seems to have become a major force after the decline of several older political structures in northern Mesopotamia. But who established its first royal house? Where did these rulers come from? Were they members of a local elite who gradually consolidated authority? Or did a new ruling group arrive from another region and establish itself over existing populations? One of the most intriguing clues comes from personal names. Most of the population within the Mitanni realm appears to have spoken languages belonging to the Hurrian cultural and linguistic sphere. Hurrian traditions were deeply rooted in northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Yet several Mitanni royal names and technical terms have Indo-Aryan connections. Names such as Shatiwaza and Tushrata have attracted considerable scholarly attention, as have specialized terms associated with horses and chariot warfare. These linguistic traces have led to an important hypothesis. Perhaps a small Indo-Aryan-speaking warrior elite became integrated into Hurrian society and eventually formed part of the ruling establishment. Such a process would not necessarily imply a large-scale migration. A relatively small military or aristocratic group could have gained prestige through chariot warfare, entered local political networks, and eventually become associated with kingship. But the evidence remains incomplete. The famous treaty between the Mitanni king Shatiwaza and the Hittite ruler Shupoluliuma I invokes deities whose names include Indra, Mitra, Varuna, and the Nasatya gods. Their appearance in a Near Eastern diplomatic document is remarkable. It demonstrates that Indo-Aryan religious terminology existed within the Mitanni royal sphere. Yet, does this identify the dynasty's place of origin? Not necessarily. Religious vocabulary can travel between societies through elite networks, military traditions, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. A foreign linguistic influence within a royal court does not automatically reveal where the ruling family originated. Another possibility is that the dynasty developed locally while incorporating traditions from distant regions. The Mitanni elite may have been culturally mixed, drawing upon Hurrian institutions, Mesopotamian administrative practices, and Indo-Aryan elements associated with chariot warfare. This would help explain why the kingdom appears both familiar and unusual within the political landscape of its time. More speculative interpretations have proposed larger migrations from regions farther east, sometimes connecting the Mitanni elite with broad movements of Indo-European-speaking peoples. These theories vary considerably in their evidence and should be treated cautiously. Archaeology has not demonstrated a straightforward population replacement that corresponds neatly with the appearance of Mitanni power. Perhaps the most important clue is the absence of evidence. The royal capital, Waššukanni, has not been securely identified, and a substantial Mitanni royal archive comparable to those discovered at other Near Eastern capitals has not emerged. Without such archives, historians are forced to reconstruct the dynasty largely through documents written by neighboring powers. Egyptian correspondence describes Mitanni kings as diplomatic equals. Hittite records reveal military confrontation and political rivalry. Assyrian sources preserve fragments of later events. Each perspective illuminates part of the picture, but none tells the story entirely from within. And so, the origins of the Mitanni dynasty remain suspended between archaeology, linguistics, and political history. Was its royal house born from a local Hurrian elite, shaped by a small foreign warrior group, or created through a more complex mixture of peoples and traditions? Until the missing pieces of the Mitanni record come to light, the dynasty's first chapter remains uncertain, a royal lineage remembered by powerful neighbors, yet still waiting for its own voice to emerge from the soil. From the uncertain beginnings of the Mitanni royal house, the trail now moves toward a city whose final days left a very different kind of evidence. On the plain near the Orontes River in southern Anatolia, the mound of Tel Achana preserves the remains of Alalakh, a major Bronze Age center whose palaces, temples, archives, and houses reveal a world deeply connected to the kingdoms of northern Syria. Among its many archaeological layers, one stands out for the abrupt transformation that followed. Alalakh 7. Around the middle of the 15th century BC, Alalakh was closely connected with the Mitanni political sphere. The city had a substantial palace complex, administrative buildings, and a long tradition of regional importance. Cuneiform tablets discovered at the site document treaties, land transactions, royal appointments, and correspondence, providing an unusually detailed glimpse into political life. Then the settlement was violently disrupted. Archaeological evidence from the destruction associated with Alalakh 7 includes collapsed architecture, burned materials, and objects left amid the remains. Afterward, the city continued in altered form, but the political order represented by the earlier settlement had changed. The obvious question is who caused the destruction. The answer is not as clear as the physical evidence might suggest. Alalakh occupied a strategically important position between inland Syria and the Mediterranean coast. Whoever controlled it could influence routes connecting the interior with ports and agricultural regions. That made the city valuable to larger powers, including the Mitanni kingdom and the expanding Hittite state of Anatolia. During this period, the balance of power was shifting. The Hittite king Tudhaliya I and his successors were extending Hittite influence southward, while Mitanni remained a major force in northern Syria. Egyptian rulers also maintained interests in the region. Alalakh therefore existed within a political landscape where alliances could change rapidly. Some interpretations have associated the destruction of Alalakh 7 with Hittite military expansion. Hittite campaigns into northern Syria are documented during the broader period, and later Hittite rulers would become deeply involved in the region. Yet, establishing a direct connection between a particular military campaign and the destruction layer at Alalakh requires more evidence than the archaeological remains alone provide. Could the city have been attacked by a rival local power? Could internal political conflict have contributed to its collapse? Or was the destruction one episode within a wider military campaign whose surviving records have not yet been connected securely to the site? The tablets provide important clues, but they do not offer a simple narrative of the city's final moments. They reveal a political world of competing rulers, shifting loyalties, and complex relationships. Yet, the identity of the force responsible for the destruction remains difficult to establish with confidence. There is another complication. Destruction by fire can produce a dramatic archaeological signature, but fire does not automatically reveal who caused it. Warfare, accidental burning, deliberate demolition, or a combination of events can leave overlapping traces. Archaeologists must therefore distinguish between what the material evidence demonstrates and what later historical reconstruction merely suggests. Some more speculative interpretations have proposed that Alalakh's destruction might reflect a larger regional upheaval involving several competing powers. In such a scenario, the city could have been caught between expanding states rather than targeted by a single, identifiable conqueror. The uncertainty is especially striking because Alalakh was not an isolated settlement. Its archives connect it to a network stretching across Syria and Anatolia. The city's destruction therefore belongs to a much larger story about the transformation of power in the ancient Near East. By the later 15th century BC, the political order of northern Syria was changing rapidly. Mitanni influence remained significant, but Hittite ambitions were growing. Egypt continued to intervene diplomatically and militarily. Smaller kingdoms were forced to navigate between these larger powers. Alalakh stood directly within that pressure zone. Its burned remains preserve the aftermath, but not the name of the hand that set the city alight. Somewhere within the unfinished archaeological record may lie an inscription, weapon, administrative tablet, or undiscovered layer capable of identifying the conquerors. Until then, Alalakh 7 leaves us with an unusually persistent question. When the city fell, was it the victim of one identifiable campaign, or a casualty of a much larger struggle for control of northern Syria? From the burned remains of Alalakh, the trail now moves northward into the highlands of central Anatolia, where the broad plains around modern Shahr-i preserve the remains of Acemhöyük. rising as a massive archaeological mound above the surrounding landscape. The site once belonged to a thriving Bronze Age settlement positioned along important routes linking central Anatolia with Syria and Mesopotamia. Acemhöyük flourished during the early 2nd millennium BC, particularly during the period associated with the old Assyrian trading networks. Merchants from northern Mesopotamia established commercial communities across Anatolia, exchanging textiles, metals, and other valuable commodities. Acemhöyük appears to have participated in this wider economic system, making it an important center within a landscape of long-distance trade. But beneath the settlement lie layers that suggest repeated episodes of destruction and rebuilding. The most important evidence comes from monumental buildings known as the Sarikaya Palace and Hattupler Mansion. Their remains reveal a complex administrative and residential environment, with storerooms, seals, luxury objects, and architectural features associated with elite authority. The discovery of seal impressions has provided valuable evidence for understanding the political and economic connections of the site. Then, the archaeological sequence becomes more difficult to interpret. Several structures show evidence of fire, destruction, abandonment, or major rebuilding. In some areas, burned materials and collapsed architectural elements indicate that buildings experienced intense disruption. Yet, destruction layers are rarely simple historical signatures. Fire can result from warfare, accidental disasters, internal conflict, or deliberate destruction during political transition. So, what happened at Acemhöyük? One possibility is warfare. The early 2nd millennium BC was a period of intense competition among Anatolian kingdoms and regional powers. Political authority was fragmented, and control over trade routes could bring considerable wealth. A settlement as prosperous as Acemhöyük may therefore have attracted rivals. But there is no single inscription announcing the identity of a conquering army. This absence is significant. Archaeologists can identify destruction, but identifying the people responsible requires additional evidence. Weapons, human remains, inscriptions, and changes in material culture can sometimes provide clues. At Acemhöyük, however, the evidence does not yet produce a straightforward account of who caused each episode of disruption. The site's commercial connections add another layer of complexity. Assyrian merchants depended upon stable political conditions to protect their trade. Their networks connected Anatolian settlements with the major cities of northern Mesopotamia, and Acemhöyük appears to have occupied an important position within this economic landscape. A political crisis could therefore have affected not only the settlement itself, but also the wider commercial system surrounding it. Some interpretations have connected destruction episodes at Anatolian sites with broader political upheavals during the transition between the early and Middle Bronze Age. Others emphasize changes in regional power structures, shifts in trade routes, or the movement of political centers. More speculative explanations sometimes envision large-scale invasions sweeping across Anatolia. Such scenarios are difficult to establish because archaeological destruction does not automatically prove mass migration or foreign conquest. A burned building is evidence of fire. Determining why it burned requires a much wider body of information. Acemhöyük is especially valuable because it preserves evidence of both prosperity and disruption. Luxury goods, administrative objects, architectural remains, and seal impressions reveal a settlement deeply integrated into the economic life of its period. The destruction layers, by contrast, remind us how quickly such systems could be interrupted. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that the site did not suffer from one isolated catastrophe. Instead, its archaeological sequence may reflect several episodes of political instability unfolding over generations, each leaving behind another layer of rebuilding. If so, the burned walls are not the remains of one forgotten event, but fragments of a much longer cycle of conflict, recovery, and transformation. Somewhere beneath the surviving mound, additional structures may still clarify the sequence. A new inscription could identify a ruler. A seal impression might reveal an unfamiliar political connection. A carefully dated destruction layer could finally connect Acemhöyük to events recorded elsewhere in Anatolia. For now, the evidence remains incomplete. The fires are visible, the rebuilding is measurable, and the prosperity of the settlement is unmistakable. But the precise forces that brought each destructive episode remains uncertain, leaving Acemhöyük as another archaeological landscape where the evidence survives more clearly than the explanation. From the layered destruction at Acemhöyük, the trail leads toward another people whose story becomes clearer only after they had already entered the center of Near Eastern power. The Kassites would eventually rule Babylon for roughly 4 centuries, yet their beginnings remain remarkably difficult to reconstruct. Picture the Zagros Mountains rising east of Mesopotamia, a rugged world of valleys, forests, pasture lands, and narrow routes connecting highland communities with the fertile plains below. Somewhere within this broad region lived the people later known as the Kassites. Their language survives only in fragments, and their earliest homeland has never been identified with complete certainty. The Kassites first appear in Mesopotamian records during the Old Babylonian period, around the 18th century BC. At this stage, they were not yet the rulers of Babylon. Instead, they seem to have existed as one of several groups inhabiting or moving through the regions east of Mesopotamia. Their sudden appearance in written sources raises an important historical problem. Where had they come from? The traditional explanation places their homeland somewhere in the western or central Zagros, based partly on later references and the geographical context of their early encounters with Mesopotamian states. Some Kassite-related place names and personal names have also been associated with regions east of the Tigris, but the evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Unlike the Egyptians, Babylonians, or Assyrians, the Kassites left relatively few texts in their own language. Much of what we know comes from Babylonian documents written by scribes who belong to a different cultural tradition. Their records reveal the Kassites mainly through warfare, diplomacy, administration, and royal succession. The first major historical turning point came during the period of Babylon's vulnerability following the reign of Hammurabi and his successors. In the 16th century BC, the Hittite king Mursili I famously attacked Babylon, weakening the existing political order. Not long afterward, Kassite rulers established themselves in Babylon. Yet the exact process remains uncertain. Did Kassite warriors conquer the city directly? Did Kassite leaders gradually gain influence through military service and political alliances? Or did they enter a weakened kingdom and assume authority through a combination of force and negotiation? The surviving evidence does not provide a complete sequence of events. What is clear is that Kassite rule eventually became deeply integrated into Babylonian society. Their kings adopted Babylonian royal traditions, sponsored temples, used the Akkadian language for administration, and presented themselves as legitimate rulers of Babylonia. This makes their earlier history even more intriguing. If the Kassites were originally outsiders, how did they become so thoroughly embedded within Babylonian political culture? Was their arrival the result of a large migration, or could a relatively small elite have gained control over an existing population? Some scholars have suggested that the Kassites may have entered Mesopotamia gradually, rather than through a single massive invasion. Their early presence in the region could have developed over generations before political circumstances allowed their leaders to seize greater authority. Other interpretations place greater emphasis on military expansion from the Zagros. Such theories fit the geographical setting, but archaeological evidence for a dramatic Kassite invasion remains limited. Their language adds another layer of uncertainty. Kassite is poorly understood and does not fit neatly into the major language families securely identified in the ancient Near East. A number of Kassite words survive, particularly personal names, divine names, and specialized terminology, but the surviving vocabulary is too limited to reconstruct their original language with confidence. Could their language preserve clues to a homeland that has not yet been identified? Possibly. Yet, without a larger body of texts, linguistic reconstruction remains cautious. Even the famous Kassite period in Babylon does not completely solve the problem. By the time Kassite kings controlled Babylonia, they had adopted many local traditions, making it difficult to distinguish older Kassite customs from the Babylonian culture they inherited. Perhaps the most important clue lies in this transformation itself. The Kassites were able to enter one of the world's oldest urban civilizations and eventually govern it for generations without erasing its established institutions. Their rise, therefore, may not have been a simple story of conquest. It may have involved migration, military service, political opportunity, cultural adaptation, and gradual accumulation of authority. Somewhere in the Zagros, or perhaps within the archaeological record of early 2nd millennium Mesopotamia, evidence may still exist that could illuminate the Kassites before Babylon became their kingdom. Until then, the people who ruled Babylon for centuries remained surprisingly elusive in the generations before their rise. A powerful dynasty whose later history is well documented, but whose first steps toward the Babylonian throne are still waiting to be traced. From the uncertain beginnings of the Kassites, the trail now returns toward northern Syria, to a kingdom whose center is far easier to identify than its final chapter. Beneath the modern city of Aleppo lie the remains of a much older political world, where the kingdom of Yamkhad once controlled a strategic region between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. Picture the citadel rising above the surrounding plain, its position commanding routes that connected the Euphrates basin with the Levantine coast. More than 3,800 years ago, this landscape belonged to Yamkhad, a powerful Amorite kingdom that flourished during the early 2nd millennium BC. Its capital, Aleppo, was known in ancient texts as Halab and became one of the major political centers of northern Syria. For generations, Yamkhad appears to have been a formidable regional power. Its rulers maintained diplomatic relationships, controlled agricultural territory, and participated in the political struggles that shaped northern Mesopotamia and Syria. The kingdom's importance is particularly visible in texts from neighboring states, including archives discovered at Mari and Alalakh. Then, in the 17th century BC, the political order changed dramatically. The Hittite king Mursili I launched a campaign deep into Syria and Mesopotamia. Around 1595 BC, according to the commonly used Middle Chronology, Hittite forces captured Babylon. Earlier in the campaign, Hittite expansion had already struck at Yamkhad and its capital. Aleppo was defeated. But the fall of a capital does not necessarily mean the immediate disappearance of a kingdom. This is where the historical record becomes difficult. Yamkhad had been built upon a network of cities, agricultural territories, political alliances, and local elites. Even if its royal center suffered military defeat, elements of its administration and population could have continued under new rulers. The archaeological and textual record suggests that Aleppo remained an important settlement after the destruction associated with the Hittite campaigns. Yet, the great Yamkhadite kingdom that had dominated northern Syria no longer appears in the same political form. What happened to its ruling dynasty? Did surviving members of the royal family retain influence elsewhere? Did local rulers continue governing portions of the former kingdom under new titles? Or was the political structure dismantled and gradually absorbed into competing states? The evidence offers fragments rather than a complete narrative. One important source of information comes from Alalakh, where rulers maintained connections with the political traditions of Yamkhad. The site provides evidence that northern Syrian political institutions did not simply disappear after Aleppo's defeat. Instead, authority appears to have been redistributed among smaller centers. This raises a broader possibility. Perhaps the lost kingdom was not destroyed in a single moment. Perhaps it fragmented. Large, territorial kingdoms in the Bronze Age depended upon personal relationships between kings, governors, military commanders, temples, and local communities. When the central palace fell, these networks could survive in altered forms. A kingdom might therefore disappear from political records, while many of its institutions continued beneath a different name. Some scholars have emphasized the impact of Hittite military campaigns, while others place greater weight on the shifting balance among regional powers. The rise of new dynasties, competition between Mitanni and Hittite interests, and changing control over northern Syrian trade routes all contributed to a rapidly evolving political landscape. More speculative interpretations sometimes envision a dramatic population displacement following the fall of Aleppo. Yet, the archaeological evidence does not demonstrate a complete abandonment of the region. Communities continued to live there, rebuild, trade, and worship. The disappearance was therefore political as much as physical. Yamkhad's name gradually fades from the historical stage, even though Aleppo itself endured. The city survived its conquerors, its dynasties changed, and its religious traditions continued in modified forms. That contrast may be the most compelling part of the story. A kingdom can disappear without a city disappearing. A dynasty can lose power while its population remains. And a political identity can fade from written records while its influence survives in institutions, architecture, and local traditions. Somewhere within the archaeological layers of northern Syria may still lie evidence that clarifies what happened to Yamkhad's royal house after Aleppo fell. A seal, inscription, palace archive, or overlooked settlement could potentially connect the fragments. For now, the kingdom remains suspended between conquest and transformation. Aleppo survived, but Yamkhad did not survive as the same political power, and the precise moment when one became the other remains difficult to define. Far out on the Iranian plateau, where the landscape of Sistan stretches beneath an immense and almost colorless sky, the ruins of Shahr-i Sokhta rise from the desert like the remains of a city frozen in time. Walls of sun-dried mud brick emerge from the earth. Narrow rooms, workshops, courtyards, and burial grounds form the outlines of a settlement that once stood beside flowing water. Today, there is little sound here except the wind moving across the barren ground. The name Shahr-i Sokhta means burnt city, although the name does not necessarily describe the manner of its final destruction. Founded around 3200 BC, the settlement endured for roughly 15 centuries, developing into one of the most important urban centers of the Bronze Age in eastern Iran. UNESCO describes it as a major crossroads connecting regions as distant as Central Asia, the Indus Valley, the Persian Gulf, and Mesopotamia. For centuries, people lived, worked, traded, buried their dead, and built increasingly complex structures here. And then, sometime around 1800 BC, the city was abandoned, not destroyed in a single dramatic event, not swallowed by an earthquake, not clearly conquered by an invading army. Instead, Shahr-i Sokhta appears to have gradually lost the conditions that had made urban life possible. That may be the first clue to the mystery. At its height, the city was remarkably sophisticated. Archaeological excavations have revealed separate residential, industrial, monumental, and burial areas, suggesting careful organization on a scale that challenges the assumption that early Bronze Age settlements were little more than scattered villages. Workshops produced pottery, metal objects, stone vessels, and ornaments, while evidence of long-distance exchange demonstrates that the inhabitants participated in a network extending across much of the ancient Eastern world. The city had prospered because of its position, but its greatest advantage may also have been its greatest vulnerability: water. Shahr-i Sokhta was established near the ancient channels of the Helmand River system. At the time of its foundation, the surrounding landscape was considerably more favorable to settlement. Watercourses supported agriculture, movement, and the concentration of population necessary for a large urban center. Yet, rivers do not always remain where people expect them to. Over generations, channels can shift, deltas can migrate, flood patterns can change. A river that once nourished fields can gradually move away from them, leaving behind land that becomes increasingly difficult to cultivate. UNESCO identifies changes in watercourses together with climate change as the principal explanation for the eventual abandonment of Shahr-i Sokhta. It is a remarkably ordinary explanation for such an extraordinary disappearance. There may have been no final battle. No conquering king may have entered through the city gates. The end may have arrived slowly, season after season, as the balance between people and water became increasingly difficult to maintain. Imagine a city whose wells and canals still function, but less reliably than before. Fields produce smaller harvests. Travelers begin taking different routes. Workshops become harder to sustain. Families leave in search of more dependable farmland. As the population falls, maintaining infrastructure becomes more difficult, which in turn makes the settlement even less attractive. Eventually, departure itself becomes self-reinforcing. Yet, the archaeological record does not make the story entirely simple. The city contains evidence of fires, and its very name, Burnt City, has encouraged generations of speculation about catastrophe. But the evidence does not support a single massive conflagration destroying Shahr-i Sokhta at the end of its existence. UNESCO's documentation notes that destructive fires occurred at different times and were not extensive enough, or closely enough connected, to demonstrate an invasion or deliberate destruction. This distinction matters. A city can burn without being destroyed by an enemy. A fire can consume a building while the surrounding community survives. And several fires separated by long periods tell a very different story from one final blaze, so the possibility of conquest becomes weaker. There is also no compelling archaeological evidence for a foreign invasion being responsible for the city's abandonment. The same UNESCO documentation specifically notes that the hypothesis of invasion and widespread sacking lacks convincing evidence. That leaves us with something more subtle: environmental pressure. But even this explanation raises another question. Was climate alone enough? Climate change is not necessarily a single catastrophic event. It can mean a gradual alteration in rainfall, temperature, river behavior, or seasonal patterns. In an environment already dependent upon a limited water supply, relatively modest changes could have profound consequences. The Helmand system was especially important because the region's settlements depended heavily upon its changing channels and associated wetlands. UNESCO documentation describes water as one of the decisive forces shaping both the formation and destruction of settlements throughout the region. If the river shifted far enough away from Shahr-i Sokhta, the city might have remained physically intact while becoming economically impossible to sustain. That possibility creates a haunting image. The buildings may have stood while the people left. Workshops may have fallen silent one by one. Courtyards that once filled with conversation may have become empty. And eventually, the city itself became a place where nobody needed to live anymore. There is another mystery hidden within this disappearance. If the inhabitants migrated, where did they go? The archaeological record tells us that Shahr-i Sokhta was abandoned, but abandonment does not automatically reveal the destination of the people who left. They may have moved toward surviving watercourses. They may have joined neighboring settlements. They may have divided into smaller communities. Some groups may have traveled along the same trade routes that once brought goods into the city. But no single destination has emerged as the definitive successor to Shahr-i Sokhta. This is where the ruins become more mysterious. The city was not an isolated experiment. It belonged to a much larger network of Bronze Age societies. Its inhabitants exchanged goods and ideas with distant regions, and archaeological discoveries reveal connections extending toward the Indus world, Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and southwestern Iran. So, perhaps Shahr-i Sokhta did not simply disappear. Perhaps its population dispersed into the wider landscape, carrying fragments of its traditions with them. Or perhaps several different processes occurred at once. Environmental stress weakened the city, economic networks changed, and neighboring settlements became more attractive. This possibility is important because ancient cities rarely have a single cause of death. A settlement can survive drought if its political system is strong enough. It can survive economic disruption if its agricultural base remains productive. It can survive a shifting river if its population can relocate its fields. But when several pressures arrive together, resilience can disappear surprisingly quickly. Shahr-i Sokhta may therefore represent not a mysterious catastrophe, but a complex failure of adaptation. And yet, the desert preserves questions as effectively as it preserves objects. The dry environment has helped protect architecture, burials, and countless artifacts, giving archaeologists an unusually detailed glimpse into the lives of the people who once inhabited the city. Every excavated room adds another fragment. Every burial reveals something about those who stayed. Every workshop suggests a trade or craft. Every abandoned structure raises the same silent question. Why here? Why then? And where did everyone go? Perhaps future archaeological work will identify settlements that received migrants from Shahr-i Sokhta. Perhaps new environmental evidence will clarify exactly how the Helmand's changing course affected agriculture. Or perhaps the final chapter will remain fragmented, scattered across the desert alongside the walls and objects left behind. For now, the most convincing explanation is also the least dramatic. Water changed, climate placed additional pressure on the region, and eventually the people of Shahr-i Sokhta moved elsewhere. But a reasonable explanation is not always a complete one. The city still stands beneath the desert sky, silent and exposed, preserving traces of a society that flourished for more than 1,000 years before its streets became empty. And somewhere beyond those walls, perhaps beneath an unexcavated mound or within another forgotten settlement, the missing final chapter of Shahr-i Sokhta may still be waiting to be found. Far to the south of ancient Babylon, beyond the great urban centers of Mesopotamia, lay a landscape unlike the monumental cities that dominate our picture of the ancient Near East. Here, the earth gave way to marshes, shifting waterways, reeds, islands, and shallow lagoons where land and water were never entirely separate. Somewhere within this difficult terrain, more than 3,000 years ago, a political power emerged that would challenge the kings of Babylon. Its name has survived only in fragments: the Sealand Dynasty. For much of its history, this kingdom remains one of the most elusive political powers of ancient Mesopotamia. Its rulers appear in king lists. Their names survive on tablets and inscriptions. Objects associated with their administration have been discovered. Yet, the kingdom itself remains remarkably difficult to reconstruct. Who founded it? Where exactly was its capital? How did a power based in the southern marshlands survive between far larger and more established kingdoms? And perhaps most intriguingly, where did the people who created the Sealand dynasty come from? The mystery begins after one of the great disruptions of Mesopotamian history. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, Babylon was no longer the unquestioned center of southern Mesopotamia. The Kassites eventually established control over Babylon, but their rise did not erase every independent political tradition in the south. In the watery region near the Persian Gulf, another dynasty emerged, one that ancient Babylonian sources remembered as the rulers of the Sealand. The name itself is revealing. It may refer to a territory dominated by marshes and waterways near the ancient shoreline, perhaps extending toward the head of the Persian Gulf. But the exact boundaries of this region remain uncertain. The coastline of Mesopotamia has changed dramatically over thousands of years, while rivers have repeatedly shifted their courses. A place that was once an island, riverbank, or coastal settlement may today lie beneath layers of sediment or far from the modern shoreline. This makes the Sealand dynasty unusually difficult to locate. Unlike Babylon, whose ruins provide a monumental architectural record, the Sealand kingdom has left behind comparatively little that can be confidently identified as its political center. And yet, it was not insignificant. The surviving king lists preserve a sequence of Sealand rulers, including figures such as Illuma Ili, Damki Ilishu, Gulkishar, Peshkaldaramesh, Ayadaragalama, and Ea Gamil. The chronology remains debated, but these names establish that the dynasty was not simply a fleeting rebellion. It represented a political tradition that endured for generations. The earliest ruler is especially important. Illuma Ili appears in later Babylonian historical traditions as a rival of the Kassite rulers of Babylon. Some sources associate him with resistance against Babylonian authority, suggesting that the Sealand kingdom may have emerged partly from the political fragmentation that followed earlier upheavals. But that explanation leaves an important gap. If Illuma Ili founded the dynasty, what was his background? Was he a local ruler from the southern marshlands? Was he descended from an older Mesopotamian political family? Did he represent displaced communities that had survived the collapse of earlier regimes? Or did his dynasty emerge from a population whose origins were already intertwined with the diverse peoples of southern Mesopotamia? The evidence does not provide a definitive answer. One possibility is that the Sealand dynasty developed from indigenous southern traditions that had remained politically active even while Babylon and other cities dominated the historical record. The marshlands were not empty wilderness. They supported communities, agriculture, fishing, transportation, and trade. Water itself could provide protection. An army accustomed to moving across open plains might find it difficult to operate effectively in a landscape of canals, reed beds, islands, and unpredictable waterways. A political power base there could therefore survive in a region that was difficult for larger states to control. In this interpretation, the Sealand dynasty was not an inexplicable intrusion. It was a natural product of the southern landscape. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the dynasty represented a displaced political tradition that gained new strength in the marshes. Mesopotamia had experienced repeated wars, migrations, dynastic collapses, and changes in imperial power. Populations could move, ruling families could lose their cities, and military groups could establish themselves in regions beyond the reach of established authorities. The Sealand may have offered precisely such a refuge. The marshes could shelter a claimant to power, while simultaneously providing access to the Persian Gulf and the commercial routes connected to it. And trade may have been one of the kingdom's greatest strengths. The southern waterways connected Mesopotamia with the Gulf, while maritime routes extended toward regions associated with ancient Dilmun and farther east. The Sealand's position may therefore have given its rulers access to networks that were strategically valuable to Babylon and its rivals. Could control of these waterways have been as important as control of a city? Perhaps. In Mesopotamian political thought, kingship was often expressed through monumental cities, temples, walls, and palaces. Yet, a marshland kingdom would have operated according to different geographical realities. Its power may have been distributed across settlements and waterways rather than concentrated in a single, enormous urban center. That could help explain why its archaeological footprint remains so elusive. There are tantalizing discoveries that have been connected to the Sealand period, including inscribed objects and administrative documents, but assigning them to a specific political center remains difficult. Some discoveries have even challenged older assumptions about how isolated the Sealand kingdom really was. One particularly intriguing aspect is the evidence for cultural continuity. The rulers of the Sealand dynasty used Mesopotamian royal names, titles, and religious traditions. Their inscriptions were written in the cuneiform tradition. They were not an entirely foreign civilization appearing suddenly at the edge of Mesopotamia. Yet, neither does the surviving evidence allow us to reconstruct a simple line of descent from an earlier dynasty. The Sealand appears to occupy an uncertain middle ground, familiar enough to belong to Mesopotamia, distinct enough to remain difficult to explain. Later, Babylonian traditions remembered some Sealand rulers with hostility, particularly when they had challenged Babylonian authority. But the surviving sources were largely written by the civilizations that eventually outlasted them. How much of the Sealand's own story has therefore been lost, and how much has been filtered through the perspectives of its rivals? There is even a temptation to search for something more dramatic, an unknown population arriving from beyond Mesopotamia, bringing a new dynasty into the southern marshes. Such theories occasionally appear when evidence is scarce, but there is currently no firm basis for identifying the Sealand rulers as representatives of a mysterious foreign civilization. The simpler explanation remains stronger. They were probably part of the complex cultural world of southern Mesopotamia, shaped by its languages, religions, political traditions, and trade networks. But their exact origins remain uncertain, and that uncertainty becomes even more fascinating when we consider what happened afterward. The Sealand dynasty eventually disappeared from political history, only to be followed by later rulers and new configurations of power. The marshlands continued to play a role in southern Mesopotamia, but the dynasty itself faded from the record. Its kings survived mainly as names. Its territory remains debated. Its capital has not been securely identified, and the circumstances surrounding its emergence remain partly hidden. Perhaps the answer lies beneath the sediments of an ancient river channel, where a settlement once stood before the waterways shifted. Perhaps it survives in an archive that has never been excavated. Or perhaps the Sealand dynasty was never as mysterious to its own inhabitants as it appears to us now. They may have known exactly where their ancestors came from, why their kingdom was founded, and how its rulers claimed their authority. That knowledge simply did not survive. What remains is a handful of names, scattered inscriptions, uncertain archaeological traces, and the outline of a kingdom that once occupied one of the most difficult landscapes in the ancient Near East. And somewhere among the vanished waterways of southern Mesopotamia, the origins of the Sealand dynasty may still be waiting beneath the mud and reeds, quietly preserving the answer to a question that the surviving tablets never fully resolved. Beyond the modern settlements of Turkmenistan, where the Karakum Desert stretches toward the horizon in a vast expanse of sand and pale earth, the remains of Gonur rise from the landscape almost unexpectedly. What first appears to be little more than a low collection of ancient mounds was once something far more complex, a major Bronze Age settlement surrounded by a world of rivers, oases, fields, workshops, temples, and carefully planned buildings. For centuries, people came here. They built walls from mud brick. They buried their dead in carefully arranged graves. They produced pottery, worked metals, traded distant materials, and developed elaborate religious traditions. And then, sometime toward the end of its long occupation, Gonur changed. The transformation was not necessarily a single catastrophe. Instead, the settlement appears to have entered a period of decline and reorganization whose causes remain difficult to reconstruct. That makes its final centuries particularly intriguing. Gonur Depe was one of the most important sites associated with the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, often abbreviated as the BMAC, a Bronze Age cultural tradition that flourished across parts of present-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and neighboring regions during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. At its height, Gonur was not an isolated desert village. It was a substantial settlement with monumental architecture, defensive walls, ceremonial spaces, residential areas, craft production, and extensive burial grounds. Archaeological research has revealed evidence of long-distance contacts reaching into Iran, Central Asia, and regions farther east. The settlement seems to have emerged in an environment that was very different from the deserts surrounding it today. Ancient waterways and irrigated landscapes made agriculture possible. The Murghab river system created an oasis in an otherwise arid region, allowing communities to concentrate around dependable sources of water. But that dependence carried a hidden vulnerability. The same rivers that made Gonur possible could also determine its fate. The Murghab was not a perfectly stable water source. Rivers in arid environments can change course, divide into channels, shrink, or disappear from particular areas. An irrigation system that worked for generations could become increasingly difficult to maintain if the water moved elsewhere. Could something like this have happened at Gonur? The archaeological evidence suggests that environmental change played an important role in the transformation of the settlement, although the precise sequence remains uncertain. By the later phases of the site, the settlement was no longer the same place it had once been. Some areas were abandoned. Other spaces appear to have continued in use. The great concentration of activity that characterized earlier periods seems to have weakened. Yet, this is where the story becomes more complicated. Gonur did not simply vanish. Its decline appears to have been part of a broader transformation affecting the oasis settlements of the region. The communities associated with the BMAC were living at the edge of what was possible. Their prosperity depended upon carefully managed relationships between water, agriculture, livestock, trade, and labor. Maintaining such a system required constant effort. Canals had to be maintained. Fields had to be cultivated. Settlements had to remain connected. Trade routes had to function. And political or religious institutions had to coordinate resources. If even one part of this system weakened, the consequences could spread. A change in the river might reduce agricultural production. Reduced harvests could affect trade. Declining trade could weaken elite institutions. As population patterns changed, the labor required to maintain irrigation could become harder to organize. There is no need for a single disaster. A complex society can gradually become less sustainable. Yet, Gonur contains details that continue to attract attention. The site has produced remarkable burials, including elaborate grave goods, evidence of ritual practices, and objects whose origins suggest connections extending far beyond the immediate oasis. Some artifacts indicate contacts with regions separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. This raises another question. How deeply connected was Gonur to the wider Bronze Age world? Was it a local center that participated occasionally in long-distance exchange, or was it part of a much larger network linking communities across Central and South Asia? The answer matters because the decline of Gonur may have been connected not only to environmental changes, but also to changes in those wider networks. Trade systems are rarely permanent. Routes shift. Partners disappear. Political centers rise and fall. new communities emerge. A settlement that once occupied a strategic position can suddenly find itself at the edge of the economic world. There are also questions about the people themselves. The archaeological culture associated with Gonur is sometimes discussed in relation to the movement of populations across Central Asia. Scholars have proposed different models for how communities associated with the BMAC interacted with neighboring regions, including areas connected to the early civilizations of South Asia. Some interpretations emphasize migration, others emphasize trade, cultural exchange, intermarriage, or the movement of specialized groups. The evidence does not justify reducing this complex process to a single migration story. Still, the possibility remains that the people connected to Gonur were part of a much larger movement of ideas and populations across the Bronze Age landscape. If so, perhaps the settlement's transformation was not simply an ending. It may have been a redistribution of people. Communities could leave one oasis and establish themselves elsewhere, carrying technologies, religious practices, artistic traditions, and memories with them. This possibility makes archaeological absence especially difficult to interpret. When a settlement becomes quiet, does that mean its people disappeared? Or did they simply continue somewhere else? At Gonur, the answer may be somewhere between the two. The site appears to have experienced changes in settlement patterns, while the wider region remained inhabited. The end of Gonur's prominence therefore seems less like a civilization suddenly erased and more like a gradual restructuring of life across the oasis network. But the final centuries still contain unanswered questions. Why did the Great Settlement lose its earlier importance? How rapidly did the transformation occur? Was the Murghab River changing course at the same time? Did increasing aridity make agriculture more difficult? Did political or economic pressures from neighboring regions contribute? Or did several smaller changes combine until the old system could no longer maintain itself? There are more speculative possibilities, too. Some have wondered whether episodes of drought, disease, conflict, or social instability may have contributed to the transformation. Such possibilities are difficult to confirm because the archaeological record rarely preserves a single clear explanation for a settlement's decline. And Gonur is no exception. There are no surviving chronicles describing its final days. No ancient historian recorded the last inhabitants leaving. No inscription announces the end of the city. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct the story from layers of soil, altered architecture, burials, ceramics, environmental evidence, and the distribution of objects. The final centuries of Gonur therefore remain strangely quiet. The walls cannot tell us whether people left willingly or under pressure. The canals cannot tell us how long water remained reliable. The graves cannot reveal where surviving families eventually traveled. And the desert preserves the remains without preserving the voices. Today, Gonur's ruins stand in a landscape that makes its ancient existence difficult to comprehend. Sand and dry earth surround structures that once belonged to a thriving oasis society. The contrast is almost unsettling. Here, where the land now appears so unforgiving, people once created an organized world dependent upon water and human cooperation. And when that balance changed, the settlement changed with it. Perhaps Gonur's final centuries were shaped primarily by environmental pressure. Perhaps the river moved, agriculture weakened, and people gradually relocated. Perhaps changes in trade and regional politics accelerated the process. Or perhaps the final transformation was the result of several forces whose individual effects were too subtle to recognize, but whose combined impact eventually brought an era to an end. What happened at Gonur may never fit into a single explanation, and perhaps that is precisely what makes the site so compelling. Its ruins do not reveal a civilization destroyed in one dramatic moment. They reveal something quieter, a society adapting, changing, fragmenting, and perhaps dispersing as the conditions around it shifted. Somewhere beneath the desert, there may still be evidence capable of clarifying those final centuries: another settlement, an undisturbed burial, an ancient canal, or an artifact connecting Gonur to a distant community. Until then, the last chapter remains incomplete. The people of Gonur left behind walls, graves, tools, ornaments, and traces of a world that once flourished beside the Murghab. But they did not leave behind an explanation for why that world changed. And as the desert wind passes over the ancient mound, the question remains: was Gonur truly abandoned, or did its people simply carry their world somewhere beyond the horizon? Far beyond the monumental ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, in the rolling landscapes of northern Mesopotamia, the ancient city of Arrapha once occupied a position between worlds. Today, the modern city of Kirkuk covers much of the ancient site, its streets and buildings layered over a settlement whose history reaches deep into the Bronze Age. Beneath the modern landscape lies the memory of a kingdom that played a significant role in the political world of the second millennium BC. Its name was Arrapha. For a time, it was associated closely with the Hurrians, a people whose language, religion, and political traditions influenced much of northern Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. Yet, the history of Arrapha remains surprisingly difficult to reconstruct. The city was known to the great powers around it. Babylon knew it. Assyria knew it. The kingdom of Mitanni knew it. And later, the expanding Assyrian state absorbed it. But before that final transformation, Arrapha existed within a complicated political landscape where borders were unstable, loyalties shifted, and kingdoms could disappear from history while leaving behind only fragments of their existence. The mystery begins with the Hurrians themselves. Unlike the Sumerians, Akkadians, or Assyrians, the Hurrians did not leave behind a single enduring empire that dominates the historical record. Instead, they appear across a broad region of the ancient Near East, particularly northern Mesopotamia and areas to the west. Their language was distinct from the better-known Semitic and Indo-European languages of the region. Their religious traditions influenced neighboring societies. Their rulers appear in diplomatic archives, and yet the origins of the Hurrian population remain debated. Where did they first emerge? How did they spread across such a wide territory? And how did communities speaking a language unrelated to the dominant languages of Mesopotamia become so deeply embedded in the political systems of the region? Arrapha provides one part of this larger puzzle. The city seems to have occupied an important location along routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Zagros Mountains. Its position made it valuable for agriculture, trade, communication, and military movement. This was not an isolated frontier town. It stood within a landscape where powerful states competed for access to resources and strategic corridors. During the early 2nd millennium BC, Arrapha appears in cuneiform records, and by the 18th century BC, the region had become connected to the expanding influence of the old Babylonian world. But political control was never permanent. As Babylonian power fluctuated, northern Mesopotamia experienced new struggles. One of the most important developments was the rise of Mitanni, a powerful Hurrian-associated kingdom that became a major force in northern Mesopotamia during the 2nd millennium BC. Arrapha eventually came into the orbit of Mitanni, but here the evidence becomes complicated. The city was not simply a capital of a vast Hurrian empire. Instead, it appears to have functioned within a network of local rulers, regional authorities, and larger imperial powers. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the political identity of Arrapha was never fixed. Perhaps its rulers survived by adapting to whichever power dominated the surrounding landscape. One generation might acknowledge Babylonian authority. Another might align with Mitanni. Later, rulers would face the growing strength of Assyria. Such political flexibility was not unusual in the ancient Near East, but it makes Arrapha harder to define. Was it truly a Hurrian kingdom, or was it a Mesopotamian city whose population and ruling elite became increasingly Hurrian? The distinction may seem subtle, but it matters. Ancient kingdoms were rarely composed of one perfectly uniform ethnic group. Cities were places of migration, intermarriage, trade, and cultural exchange. A person living in Arrapha could participate in Mesopotamian religious traditions while speaking a Hurrian language and maintaining connections with communities farther west or north. The city's identity may therefore have been layered rather than singular, and the surviving documents hint at just such complexity. The archives of the wider region preserve personal names, legal agreements, administrative records, and diplomatic references that reveal communities interacting across linguistic and political boundaries. Yet, for every answer they provide, they raise another question. How much of Arrapha's population was actually Hurrian? How widespread was Hurrian speech? Did the city's ruling elite deliberately promote a Hurrian identity? Or did that identity emerge gradually through centuries of cultural interaction? There is no single surviving document that resolves the issue. The uncertainty becomes even more striking when we consider the city's location. Modern Kirkuk stands over much of ancient Arrapha, meaning that archaeological investigation faces an unusual challenge. The ancient settlement has not survived as an untouched landscape waiting to be excavated. Instead, the modern city has grown around and across the ancient remains. Some parts of Arrapha have therefore become inaccessible, damaged, or difficult to investigate. The city exists beneath another city, and that means some of its history may remain physically out of reach. There is another reason Arrapha matters. The region was rich in natural resources, particularly petroleum-bearing deposits that would become economically important in the modern era. But long before modern industry, the area's fertile lands and strategic position already made it valuable. Ancient powers understood geography differently from modern states, but they recognized the importance of controlling productive land, routes through the mountains, and connections between northern and southern Mesopotamia. Arrapha sat within this network. Its importance may explain why so many political powers competed for influence there. Yet, political survival eventually became impossible. Assyria grew stronger. During the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Assyrian rulers increasingly pushed into northern Mesopotamia. The Hurrian political world weakened, while Assyria expanded its territorial control. Arrapha was eventually incorporated into the Assyrian sphere. By this point, the independent Hurrian political traditions that had once dominated parts of the region were fading. But disappearance from political history did not mean disappearance of culture. Hurrian religious traditions continued to influence neighboring societies. Hurrian deities became part of the religious world of the Hittites. Hurrian myths were translated and adapted. Hurrian names continued to appear in records, and elements of Hurrian culture survived long after the political structures associated with Mitanni and other Hurrian powers had collapsed. So perhaps the fate of Arrapha was not a simple disappearance. Perhaps its identity was absorbed. A city can lose its kingdom while preserving its population. A language can retreat while leaving traces in religious traditions and personal names. A political dynasty can vanish while the cultural practices it supported continue elsewhere. This makes the disappearance of Arrapha's Hurrian identity particularly difficult to define. There was no final moment when someone announced that the Hurrians had ceased to exist. Instead, the transformation occurred gradually through political conquest, cultural integration, migration, and the rise of new powers. And yet, the archaeological silence surrounding parts of Arrapha leaves room for unanswered questions. What did the city look like at the height of its Hurrian influence? Where were its temples? Where were the residences of its rulers? How did ordinary people live within the political world dominated by larger kingdoms? And what happened to those communities when Assyria absorbed the region? Some answers may still lie beneath the modern city. Perhaps an undiscovered archive could reveal the names of rulers who have disappeared from history. Perhaps inscriptions could clarify the relationship between Arrapha and the wider Hurrian world. Perhaps future excavations will reveal that the city's political role was even more significant than the surviving records suggest. For now, Arrapha remains an unusual kind of archaeological mystery. It is not completely lost. Its name is known, its general location is known, its political connections are partly documented, and yet the full identity of the city remains obscured beneath centuries of transformation. The Hurrians themselves seem to hover at the edge of the historical record, visible in fragments, influential but elusive, leaving traces in kingdoms that came after them. And Arrapha may be one of the places where those fragments once came together most clearly. Today, modern life continues above the ancient settlement, while beneath it lie the remains of a world that once belonged to a different political order. The Hurrian rulers are gone. The kingdom has disappeared. The language has fallen silent. But somewhere below the modern streets, the evidence may still survive. And if another ancient tablet, inscription, or buried structure were someday uncovered, how much might it change our understanding of who the people of Arrapha really were, and where the forgotten Hurrian kingdom began? Far beyond the familiar cities of Mesopotamia, where the Karakum Desert stretches across southern Central Asia, the remains of an extraordinary Bronze Age world lie scattered among dry riverbeds and ancient oases. Mud brick walls rise from the earth at places such as Gonur, while distant settlements appear as low mounds surrounded by a landscape that today seems almost incapable of supporting large populations. Yet, more than 4,000 years ago, people built complex communities here. They constructed fortified settlements, monumental compounds, elaborate tombs, workshops, temples, and irrigation systems. They traded across enormous distances and produced finely crafted objects whose materials came from regions far beyond their immediate surroundings. Archaeologists call this cultural tradition the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC. And then, sometime during the 2nd millennium BC, the world they created changed dramatically. The settlements did not all disappear at the same moment. Their traditions did not simply cease overnight. Instead, the archaeological record reveals a complicated transformation in which some sites declined, others were abandoned, and elements of the culture appeared to continue in different forms elsewhere. The mystery, therefore, is not simply why the BMAC disappeared. It is whether it disappeared at all. The BMAC emerged around the late 3rd millennium BC in a region encompassing parts of modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and neighboring areas. Its communities developed around oasis environments, especially those associated with the Murghab and Amu Darya river systems. These were demanding landscapes. Water was everything. Without irrigation and carefully managed river channels, large-scale agriculture would have been impossible. But with sufficient water, the oases could support densely populated settlements surrounded by fields and pastures. The inhabitants built sophisticated systems adapted to these environments. At Gonur, archaeologists have uncovered large architectural complexes, defensive walls, burial grounds, ceremonial structures, and evidence of specialized craft production. Other BMAC sites reveal similar patterns. This was not a collection of isolated villages. It was a connected cultural world. Its people participated in long-distance exchange networks linking Central Asia with Iran, the Indus region, the Eurasian steppe, and other parts of the Bronze Age world. Objects found at these settlements reveal connections that would have been difficult to maintain without organized trade and movement. But the same networks that created prosperity may also have created vulnerability. A society dependent on fragile ecological systems must constantly adapt. If a river changes course, agricultural land can become unusable. If rainfall patterns shift, pasture can deteriorate. If irrigation channels accumulate sediment or require more labor to maintain, food production can decline. And if several of these pressures occur together, an apparently prosperous settlement can become increasingly difficult to sustain. Environmental change is therefore one of the leading explanations for the transformation of the BMAC. The Murghab Delta was particularly unstable. Channels shifted over time, and settlements that had once stood near reliable water sources could eventually find themselves separated from them. The fate of Gonur offers an important example. The settlement experienced changes in its later phases, and the landscape around it was gradually transformed. Rather than being destroyed by one identifiable catastrophe, the settlement seems to have lost much of the central importance it had once possessed. But environmental change alone may not explain everything. Because the BMAC existed within a much larger world, changes elsewhere could have affected it. Trade routes were never permanent. Political centers rose and fell. Communities migrated. New groups entered Central Asia. And the balance between settled oasis societies and mobile pastoral populations could shift. During the second millennium BC, the archaeological record shows increasing interaction between BMAC-related communities and populations associated with the Eurasian steppe. This interaction is particularly intriguing. Some researchers have proposed that movements of people from the steppe contributed to major cultural changes across Central Asia. Others emphasize gradual interaction rather than large-scale migration. The evidence is complex. Archaeological similarities do not always prove that an entire population moved from one region to another. New pottery styles, burial customs, technologies, and artistic motifs can spread through trade, imitation, intermarriage, or the movement of small groups. So when the BMAC tradition begins to change, what exactly are we seeing? A population leaving? A population changing its identity? New people entering the region? Or several processes happening simultaneously? Perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the way BMAC traditions appear beyond the original oasis centers. Certain objects, artistic motifs, and cultural practices have been identified in distant regions. Some connections extend toward South Asia, raising questions about whether people associated with the BMAC participated in broader population movements that eventually influenced the societies of the Indus region. Such ideas remain debated. There is no simple archaeological chain connecting the disappearance of the BMAC to the rise of another civilization. And yet, the possibility of cultural transmission remains difficult to ignore. A civilization does not have to conquer another civilization to influence it. Sometimes, people move gradually. They marry into new communities. They carry religious objects. They introduce unfamiliar technologies. They change the vocabulary of the societies around them. And eventually, the original identity of the migrants may disappear while their cultural influence remains. Could something like this have happened to the BMAC? Perhaps. But there is another possibility: economic transformation. The Bronze Age was a period of increasingly sophisticated long-distance exchange. Metals, precious stones, ceramics, textiles, and other goods moved across enormous distances. The BMAC may have benefited from its position along these routes. But if those routes changed, settlements dependent upon them could lose their importance. A city does not need to be destroyed to decline. Its merchants simply need fewer customers. Its workshops need fewer buyers. Its political institutions need fewer resources. Its strategic location can become less strategic. Slowly, the center of gravity moves elsewhere. There is also evidence that some BMAC settlements were abandoned or reduced, while other communities continued nearby. This suggests that the disappearance was uneven. Some people may have moved toward new water sources. Others may have adopted different economic strategies. Some may have integrated with neighboring populations. The cultural identity we call BMAC could therefore have fragmented into multiple regional traditions. This is one reason the word disappearance can be misleading. Archaeologists often define cultures according to recurring material patterns, pottery styles, architecture, burial customs, tools, and other physical evidence. When those patterns change, the archaeological culture appears to end. But the people themselves do not necessarily vanish. They may continue living in the same broad region while changing their customs. The BMAC may therefore have died as an identifiable archaeological tradition while its communities survived. Still, there are darker possibilities. Could warfare have played a role? Some fortified settlements suggest that conflict was not unknown. The presence of defensive architecture has led to speculation about competition for resources or pressure from neighboring groups. But fortifications do not automatically prove that warfare caused the end of the BMAC. Could disease have contributed? It is possible, particularly in densely settled communities connected by long-distance trade. But evidence for a specific epidemic responsible for the transformation remains insufficient. Could prolonged drought have devastated the oasis systems? Environmental stress is plausible, but the precise climatic sequence remains difficult to reconstruct. And could the transformation have resulted from a combination of all these pressures? That may ultimately be the most realistic possibility. A river changes. Agricultural productivity declines. Trade routes shift. New populations arrive. Political structures weaken. People begin moving. Each event may be manageable on its own. Together, they can transform an entire cultural landscape. What makes the BMAC particularly fascinating is that its disappearance seems to have been gradual enough to leave traces of continuity, yet dramatic enough to erase the distinctive settlement patterns that once characterized the region. The great centers became quieter. The monumental compounds fell out of use. Some irrigation systems were abandoned. New settlement patterns emerged. And the cultural world that archaeologists now call the BMAC gradually faded from view. But perhaps the people themselves were never truly gone. They may have become farmers in another oasis, pastoralists on the steppe, travelers along emerging trade routes, residents of communities whose descendants no longer remembered the name of the society from which their ancestors came. Today, the ruins of Gonur and other sites remain scattered across Central Asia, silent beneath a landscape transformed by thousands of years of environmental change. Their walls preserve the outline of a society. Their graves preserve traces of individuals. Their artifacts reveal distant connections. High in the valleys and foothills of the northwestern subcontinent, where the mountains of the Hindu Kush rise above winding rivers and narrow plains, ancient graves lie scattered beneath the soil. Some contain pottery vessels. Others hold metal objects, ornaments, weapons, and the remains of people who lived thousands of years ago. There are no great royal inscriptions naming them. No surviving chronicles tell us what language they spoke. No ancient historian records the names of their chiefs. Archaeologists know them primarily through their graves. This is the world of the Gandhara grave culture, a prehistoric archaeological tradition associated with parts of present-day northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. It emerged during the 2nd millennium BC and continued in different forms for centuries. Its material remains are unmistakable. Its people are not. That distinction is what makes the Gandhara grave culture so intriguing. As the previous mysteries have shown, archaeological cultures can disappear from history while leaving behind traces that survive for millennia. In the valleys of Gandhara, those traces are unusually intimate. They are not monumental temples or enormous palaces. They are graves. And graves preserve something that buildings often cannot: evidence of individuals. At sites such as Timargara, Bhutkara, Zarif Karuna, and other locations in the region, archaeologists have discovered burial grounds associated with distinctive pottery and metal objects. Some graves contain cremated remains placed inside vessels, while others contain inhumed burials. The precise practices varied across time and place. These differences suggest that the people associated with the culture were not a completely uniform population. They were communities. And communities change. The Gandhara grave culture is generally dated to the 2nd millennium BC, with some traditions continuing into the early 1st millennium BC. It developed during a period of major transformation across Central and South Asia. Far to the west, powerful Bronze Age societies were changing. In Central Asia, BMAC communities were being transformed. Across the Iranian plateau, new cultural networks were emerging. In the northern regions, populations connected to the Eurasian steppe were expanding and interacting with settled communities. And farther east, the societies of the Indus tradition had already undergone profound changes. Gandhara stood near the intersection of many of these worlds. That geographical position immediately raises a difficult question. Were the people buried in these graves descendants of local communities? Were they newcomers? Or were they a mixture of populations who had gradually blended together? The evidence does not provide a simple answer. One early interpretation associated the Gandhara grave culture with Indo-Aryan migrations into South Asia. Similarities between certain archaeological practices and later linguistic or cultural traditions encouraged some scholars to propose that these communities represented incoming populations who eventually contributed to the development of later South Asian societies. This idea has been influential. But archaeology is rarely so straightforward. Material culture does not speak a language. A pottery style cannot tell us which language its maker spoke. A burial custom cannot by itself identify an ethnic group. And a population can adopt new technologies and rituals without being replaced by outsiders. For this reason, many researchers have approached the question more cautiously. Rather than asking whether the graves belong to one mysterious migrating people, it may be more useful to ask how different communities interacted across the region. The Gandhara valleys were connected to both mountain corridors and lowland plains. Movement through these landscapes would have been possible for traders, herders, craftsmen, families, and migrating groups. People could arrive gradually. They could intermarry. They could establish new settlements while maintaining traditions from their original homelands. Over generations, identities could become impossible to separate. The graves themselves offer clues. Pottery styles reveal regional connections. Metal objects demonstrate technological knowledge and access to raw materials. Ornaments suggest personal and perhaps social identities. And differences in burial practices may indicate changing beliefs or relationships between communities. But the evidence is fragmented. There is no single Gandhara people. Instead, archaeologists see patterns, and patterns can conceal as much as they reveal. Consider the possibility that these communities were descendants of earlier inhabitants of the region. The mountains and valleys of northwestern South Asia had supported human settlement for thousands of years. The arrival of new cultural practices does not automatically mean the arrival of an entirely new population. Or perhaps the changes were driven primarily by trade and cultural exchange. Each possibility explains part of the evidence. None explains everything. The chronology adds another layer of uncertainty. The Gandhara grave culture existed during a period when major cultural systems across South Asia were being reorganized. The urban centers of the Indus tradition had declined centuries earlier, while new regional communities emerged across the subcontinent. This was not an empty landscape waiting for a new civilization. It was already inhabited. People had memories. They had agricultural practices. They had religious traditions. They had networks of exchange. Into this complex world came new combinations of material culture. The result was neither simply an old society nor an entirely new one. It was something in between. That makes the identity of the people behind the graves particularly difficult to recover. Even their language is unknown. No substantial written archive has been securely associated with the Gandhara grave culture that could tell us what they called themselves. Imagine discovering a cemetery belonging to hundreds of people while having no surviving record of the name they used for their community. The objects remain. The bones remain. The rituals can sometimes be reconstructed, but the voices are gone. This silence has occasionally encouraged more speculative theories. Some have imagined that the graves belonged to a single migrating population that swept into the region and transformed its cultural landscape. Others have suggested connections to distant peoples based on similarities in burial practices or artifacts. Such possibilities can be useful hypotheses when tested carefully against archaeological evidence. But the evidence does not currently justify reducing the Gandhara grave culture to one dramatic migration story. The reality was probably more complicated. The people may have arrived in several waves, or perhaps only small groups migrated while local populations adopted their customs. Different valleys may have experienced different processes. Some communities may have remained relatively isolated, while others became deeply connected to distant regions. Over time, these interactions could produce the archaeological pattern we now call the Gandhara grave culture. There is also the question of what happened afterward. The cultural traditions associated with these graves did not simply end and leave an empty landscape. Later, societies developed across the same region. Languages changed. Political systems evolved. New religious traditions appeared. Trade routes expanded. Yet, traces of earlier cultural practices may have survived in transformed forms. This is where the mystery becomes larger than archaeology. A culture can disappear from the archaeological record without its people disappearing from history. Their descendants may continue living in the same valleys. Their descendants may move elsewhere. Their customs may be absorbed into newer traditions. Their original identity may simply become invisible. Today, the graves of Gandhara remain among the most important clues to understanding this period of South Asian prehistory. They reveal people who lived during an era of movement and cultural transformation. But they do not tell us exactly who those people believed themselves to be. Were they descendants of ancient communities rooted in the valleys? Were they migrants from Central Asia? Were they connected to populations moving through the mountain corridors? Or were they a mixture of many groups whose identities gradually merged? Perhaps future excavations will provide the missing evidence. Ancient DNA may reveal population movements. New archaeological sites may clarify settlement patterns. Undiscovered inscriptions, if any survive, could transform the picture entirely. Until then, the graves remain silent witnesses. Their pottery can travel across borders. Their metalwork can reveal distant connections. Their burial customs can hint at beliefs. But the names of the people themselves remain beyond reach. And as the mountain valleys darken and the ancient cemeteries disappear beneath another layer of soil, one question continues to linger. When we uncover the graves of a forgotten people, are we discovering the remains of strangers who came from elsewhere, or the buried ancestors of communities whose story never truly ended? High among the rugged hills of central Anatolia, where limestone ridges surround a broad valley and winter winds sweep across the landscape, the ruins of Hattusa stretch across the ancient terrain. Massive stone walls follow the contours of the hills. Monumental gateways stand open to empty ground. Fragments of temples, palaces, fortifications, and carved stones remain scattered across a site that once served as the heart of one of the ancient Near East's most powerful kingdoms. But before Hattusa became the capital of the Hittite Empire, another community was already here. They left behind buildings, pottery, tools, and traces of an organized settlement. Yet their story is far less familiar. Who were the people who occupied Hattusa before the Hittites transformed it into an imperial capital? The answer begins several centuries before the rise of the Hittite kingdom. Archaeological evidence indicates that Hattusa was inhabited long before it became the political center of the Hittites. The earliest settlement phases date back to the 3rd millennium BC, when central Anatolia was divided among numerous local communities. This was not an empty wilderness. Villages and small fortified settlements occupied the valleys and hills. Farmers cultivated fields. Herders moved animals across seasonal pastures. Craftsmen produced pottery, tools, and ornaments. And somewhere within this landscape, a settlement developed at the place that would eventually become Hattusa. The earliest inhabitants are difficult to identify because they did not leave behind historical records describing themselves. This creates one of archaeology's oldest problems. How do you identify a population that left objects but no written account? Pottery can tell us about technology and exchange. Architecture can reveal social organization. Burials can suggest ritual practices. But none of these things automatically tells us what language people spoke or what name they gave their community. For Hattusa, the situation becomes especially complicated because later Hittite texts preserve memories of an earlier population known as the Hattians. The name itself is important. The Hittite language was Indo-European, but the Hattian language belonged to an entirely different linguistic family. The Hattians appear to have occupied parts of central Anatolia before and during the rise of Hittite power. Their presence is preserved most clearly in religious traditions and personal names incorporated into later Hittite culture. In other words, the Hittites did not simply erase the earlier inhabitants. They absorbed elements of their world. Hattian deities, myths, and ritual traditions became part of Hittite religious practice. The Hittites even referred to their own kingdom using the name of the older land. This creates an intriguing possibility. Perhaps Hattusa was originally a Hattian center that was later conquered and transformed by an incoming Hittite-speaking elite. If so, the city we recognize today as the capital of the Hittite Empire may have begun as something very different. But when did this transformation occur? And how dramatic was it? The evidence suggests that Hattusa experienced destruction and rebuilding during the early 2nd millennium BC. At some point around the 18th century BC, the city was destroyed, an event sometimes associated with the activities of the ruler Anita of Kushara. Later, Hittite traditions preserve a remarkable memory of Anita, who claimed to have conquered Hattusa and cursed the city. Whether the historical details of the account are entirely accurate remains uncertain, but the tradition indicates that Hattusa was already a significant settlement before the formation of the Hittite imperial state. Then, centuries later, the city rose again. A ruler, traditionally identified as Hattusili I, established Hattusa as the center of the emerging Hittite kingdom. The transformation was profound. Fortifications expanded, temples multiplied, palaces and administrative buildings appeared. The city grew into a political and religious capital. Yet beneath these later monuments lay older layers. Hattusa was not created from nothing. Its Hittite identity was built over an earlier settlement landscape. This raises another question. What happened to the people who lived there before the Hittites? The simplest explanation is cultural integration. The Hittites may have conquered the region but incorporated many local inhabitants into their society. Languages can coexist. Religious traditions can merge. Local craftsmen can continue working under new rulers. Administrative systems can absorb older practices. In this scenario, the Hattians did not disappear. Their political independence disappeared. Their cultural influence remained. This would explain why Hattian religious traditions survived within the Hittite world. But there may have been more movement involved. Central Anatolia during this period was a landscape of competing kingdoms, merchant communities, and shifting political alliances. Assyrian merchants established trading colonies, including the famous settlement at Kenesh, and their records provide valuable evidence for the political complexity of Anatolia during the early 2nd millennium BC. These documents reveal a world of merchants, local rulers, trade agreements, conflicts, and constantly changing political relationships. Hattusa existed within this environment. It was not isolated. It was part of a network. Goods moved through the region. Languages came into contact. People traveled between cities. Political power shifted from one local center to another. In such a world, cultural boundaries would have been porous. The later Hittites may therefore have emerged not from a single migration into Anatolia, but through generations of interaction between populations already living there and groups speaking related Indo-European languages. This interpretation remains consistent with the archaeological evidence, although the exact process is difficult to reconstruct. There is no surviving document saying, these people arrived here, and these people were replaced. History is rarely that neat. Instead, the archaeological layers show continuity mixed with disruption. Buildings change. Pottery styles evolve. Political centers rise and fall, and traditions survive in altered forms. The Hattians themselves remain particularly elusive because almost everything known about them comes through the records of later peoples. Their own language survives mainly in short ritual passages preserved within Hittite texts. Their religious traditions are better known than their political history. Their cities are difficult to distinguish archaeologically from the wider cultures of Bronze Age Anatolia, and their final fate remains uncertain. Perhaps they gradually adopted the language of the Hittite ruling elite. Perhaps bilingual communities existed for generations. Perhaps Hattian identity survived longest in religious ceremonies and rural communities, or perhaps the distinction between Hattian and Hittite became increasingly meaningless as the two cultures merged. This process would not have been unusual. Conquest does not always mean replacement. Sometimes the conquerors become culturally transformed by the people they conquer, and Hattusa may be one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. The Hittites created an empire that stretched across much of Anatolia and northern Syria, but their religious world remained filled with older traditions. They worshipped gods whose origins predated Hittite political dominance. They preserved myths from earlier cultures. They incorporated foreign deities into their pantheon. Their empire became a mosaic of traditions. Perhaps the oldest layer of that mosaic was Hattian. Today, the ruins of Hattusa preserve both sides of the story. The monumental city belongs primarily to the Hittite age. But beneath its temples and walls lie traces of earlier communities. The stones reveal what was built. The tablets reveal what later rulers believed. But the voices of the earliest inhabitants remain almost completely silent. Who were they? How did they organize their society? What did their earliest settlement look like before the Hittite capital rose around it? And how much of their culture survived inside the empire that eventually replaced their political independence? Perhaps future excavations will reveal more clearly how the earliest settlement developed. Perhaps new discoveries will connect Hattusa to other Hattian centers and allow archaeologists to reconstruct a wider political landscape. Or perhaps the earliest inhabitants will remain known only through fragments preserved by the people who came after them. The Great Walls of Hattusa may therefore conceal a quieter mystery beneath the famous Hittite capital. Before the empire, before the monumental temples, before the royal archives filled with treaties and battles, there was another community living among these Anatolian hills. They built their homes, they buried their dead, they worshipped their gods, and eventually another people inherited their city. But as the wind moves through the ancient gateways today, one question remains suspended between the stones. When the Hittites took control of Hattusa, did they replace an older people? Or did they simply become the latest chapter in a story that had already begun centuries before? Across the open grasslands of the southern Ural region, the horizon seems almost endless. There are few landmarks to interrupt the sweep of the steppe, only low ridges, dry grass, distant rivers, and the occasional rise of an ancient burial mound. Beneath some of these mounds, archaeologists have found graves unlike almost anything else from the Bronze Age. Weapons lie beside human remains. Horse equipment appears among the offerings. Chariots were sometimes placed near the dead. And in certain graves, the evidence suggests that warfare, horses, and social status were deeply connected. These burials belong to communities that emerged after the Sintashta culture, a Bronze Age society that flourished across parts of the southern Urals and northern Kazakhstan during the 2nd millennium BC. The Sintashta communities themselves are famous for their fortified settlements, sophisticated metallurgy, and some of the earliest clear archaeological evidence for light, spoked-wheeled chariots. But their story did not end with Sintashta. Their cultural traditions spread, changed, and were transformed by successor communities across the Eurasian steppe. And in their graves, something remarkable appears to have survived. A new image of the warrior. The open steppe was not simply a wilderness separating distant civilizations. It was a landscape of movement. Pastoral communities followed seasonal resources. Metalworkers transformed copper and tin into tools and weapons. Horses became increasingly important, and networks of exchange connected communities across enormous distances. The Sintashta and post-Sintashta world existed within this rapidly changing environment. The appearance of chariots was especially significant. The earliest known chariots were not the heavy wagons used for transporting goods. They were lightweight vehicles designed for speed, pulled by teams of horses. Their archaeological remains are often fragmentary. Wood decays, leather disappears, organic materials are rarely preserved, but wheel impressions, harness fittings, cheek pieces, and associated burials sometimes provide enough evidence to reconstruct what happened. The graves therefore become more than burial places. They become archaeological snapshots of technology, status, and perhaps warfare. At sites associated with Sintashta successor traditions, horses and weapons sometimes appear alongside human burials in ways that suggest an important relationship between military identity and social prestige. But what did these people actually do? Were they professional warriors? Were weapons symbols of social authority? Did they participate in organized warfare between rival communities? Or did the presence of weapons in graves represent something more symbolic? The answer may have varied from one community to another. Archaeology can reveal that a person was buried with a weapon. It cannot automatically tell us whether that individual had ever fought in battle. A spear could be practical equipment. It could be an emblem of authority. It could be a ritual object. Or it could represent an identity that the living wished to preserve after death. Still, the concentration of weapons and horse-related equipment in certain graves is difficult to ignore. These communities appear to have placed considerable importance on mobility and martial ability, and this is where the Sintashta successor cultures become especially interesting. The original Sintashta culture did not simply disappear and leave an empty landscape. Its traditions continued into related cultural groups, including what archaeologists often describe as the Petrovka, Alalakh, and other post-Sintashta traditions. These societies occupied large areas of the steppe and forest steppe. They adapted earlier technologies to new environments. They established settlements, maintained herds, worked metals, and participated in increasingly extensive networks of interaction. Their burials preserve traces of this transformation. The graves can contain ceramic vessels, bronze weapons, ornaments, tools, and animal remains. Some burial complexes reveal social differences. Certain individuals received more elaborate treatment than others. This raises a fundamental question. Was a new social hierarchy emerging? Perhaps. The development of specialized metallurgy, horse management, and chariot technology would have created opportunities for individuals who controlled valuable skills and resources. A person who could organize horses, command a chariot team, or control access to bronze weapons might possess authority far beyond that of an ordinary herder. Over generations, such advantages could become hereditary. The burial record may therefore reflect the emergence of warrior elites, but there is another possibility. Perhaps these graves represent not permanent warrior classes, but communities in which adult male identity was strongly connected to hunting, herding, raiding, and defense. In a mobile pastoral environment, the distinction between warrior and herder may not have been as rigid as it became in later states. A man could be a herder for most of his life and still be expected to fight when necessary. The weapons in his grave might therefore represent his role within the community rather than a professional occupation. The horse introduces another layer of mystery. Horses were becoming increasingly important across the Eurasian steppe during this period, but the exact nature of early horse use remains debated. Were horses primarily used for transport, for herding, for riding, for pulling chariots, or for all of these purposes? The archaeological evidence suggests that different communities used horses in different ways. The appearance of chariots does not necessarily mean that everyone in these societies was a mounted warrior. The technology itself was specialized. Training horses required knowledge. Building lightweight vehicles required skilled craftsmanship. Coordinating horses and drivers required practice. This suggests that chariot warfare may have been concentrated among particular groups. And if so, the burial of chariots or their components could have represented elite status. But some of the most intriguing evidence comes from the animals themselves. Horse remains in ritual contexts indicate that animals could be incorporated into funerary practices. Their presence may have symbolized wealth, mobility, prestige, or a connection between the living and the dead. In later steppe societies, horses became deeply associated with identity and status. Could some of those traditions have roots in the Bronze Age? It is tempting to draw a direct line, but the evidence must be handled carefully. Cultures change over centuries. Ritual meanings evolve. Similar practices can emerge independently. The steppe was enormous, and communities separated by hundreds of kilometers were not necessarily sharing the same beliefs. Still, a broader pattern seems to emerge. The horse was becoming more than an animal. It was becoming part of a new social world. The spread of Sintashta-related technologies also raises questions about long-distance migration. Some scholars have connected these populations to the spread of Indo-Iranian languages and later cultural developments farther south and east. The combination of chariots, horses, metallurgy, and archaeological connections has made the Sintashta and post-Sintashta horizon central to discussions about population movement across Eurasia. But again, the graves cannot tell us everything. Material culture can move without mass migration. People can adopt technologies. Small groups can travel long distances and influence much larger populations. Trade networks can transmit objects and ideas across vast regions. The warriors buried in these graves therefore do not automatically represent an invading army spreading across Asia. They may instead reflect a much more gradual process. Perhaps families migrated. Perhaps specialists traveled. Perhaps communities expanded into new pastures. Perhaps local populations adopted the technologies and customs of their neighbors. Or perhaps several of these processes occurred simultaneously. The burial mounds themselves remain the most tangible evidence. Under the earth, weapons were carefully positioned. Objects were placed beside the dead. Animals were sometimes included. And in some cases, the burial arrangements appear to have been designed to communicate status long after the individual had died. Who were these people trying to impress? Their ancestors, their descendants, the gods, or the community itself? We may never know. There is also something unsettling about the contrast between the simplicity of the landscape and the complexity of the burials. The steppe offers almost no permanent monument. The wind erases tracks. Grass grows over ancient pathways. Settlements decay. Yet beneath the ground, the dead remain surrounded by carefully chosen objects. Thousands of years later, those objects become the only witnesses to a social world that left almost no written record. Perhaps the warrior burials tell us that violence was becoming increasingly important. Perhaps they tell us that horses had become symbols of prestige. Perhaps they reveal the emergence of elites capable of controlling metal production, animals, and mobility. Or perhaps the graves are telling a more complicated story in which warfare was only one part of a broader social transformation. The Sintashta successor cultures eventually changed again. New communities emerged. Old settlements were abandoned. Trade routes shifted. Populations moved. And the distinctive burial traditions gradually evolved into other forms. On the edge of Iran's northern plains, where the Alborz Mountains rise in the distance, and the landscape gradually opens toward the vast interior of the Iranian plateau, a low mound interrupts the earth. It does not resemble a city in the way Babylon or Persepolis does. There are no towering monuments rising above the horizon. Instead, Tepe Hissar appears as a quiet archaeological mound, its layers built one upon another over centuries of human occupation. Yet, beneath this unassuming landscape lies the remains of a settlement that once belonged to a much larger world. People lived here for generations. They built houses, produced pottery, worked stone and metal, buried their dead, and participated in networks connecting northeastern Iran with Central Asia and Mesopotamia. Then, sometime around the middle of the second millennium BC, the settlement declined. The reasons remain uncertain. Tepe Hissar, near the modern city of Damgan, was occupied from the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods into the Bronze Age. Its archaeological layers preserve a long sequence of cultural change, making the site particularly valuable for understanding how communities in northeastern Iran adapted to changing conditions. But long occupation does not necessarily mean continuous stability. The settlement changed repeatedly. Architecture was rebuilt. Pottery styles evolved. Craft traditions developed. New forms of metalworking appeared, and the people living at Tepe Hissar maintained connections with distant regions. This makes the site's later decline especially interesting. Why would a settlement that had survived for so long eventually lose its importance? One possibility lies in geography. Tepe Hisar occupied a strategic location along routes linking the Iranian plateau with Central Asia. The surrounding region offered access to agricultural land, mineral resources, and pathways through the mountains. Trade may have been important. Objects discovered at the site indicate connections extending beyond the immediate region. Some materials and artistic traditions have parallels elsewhere in Iran and Central Asia, but trade routes are never permanent. A route can shift because political centers change. A settlement can lose importance because another community gains control of a more efficient corridor. And when trade declines, specialized crafts and urban activity may decline with it. Yet, this explanation alone may be insufficient. Tepe Hisar was not simply a trading station. Its inhabitants also depended upon agriculture and local resources. The surrounding environment was capable of supporting settled communities, but it was not limitless. Climate fluctuations could affect rainfall, river systems, groundwater, and agricultural productivity. A settlement that had survived previous environmental changes might eventually encounter a combination of conditions that proved more difficult to overcome. But can climate really explain the decline? The answer remains uncertain. There is no single archaeological layer at Tepe Hisar that can be identified as the unmistakable result of a catastrophic drought. Instead, the evidence points toward gradual changes. This distinction is important. Ancient settlements rarely collapse according to a single dramatic timeline. A community may lose population over decades. Craft production may become less intensive. Some buildings may no longer be maintained. Trade connections may weaken. Families may move elsewhere. Eventually, archaeologists encounter an apparent end, even though the process itself unfolded slowly. Tepe Hisar may represent exactly this kind of transformation. Another clue comes from metallurgy. The settlement was associated with important metalworking traditions, and archaeological discoveries demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of copper and other materials. Metal was valuable. It could be exchanged over long distances. It could also provide tools, weapons, ornaments, and symbols of status. A community with access to metal resources and skilled craftsmen could occupy an important position within regional networks. But metallurgy depends on more than technology. It requires raw materials, fuel, skilled labor, trade connections, and political stability. If any of these became unreliable, production could suffer. Could changes in regional exchange networks have weakened Tepe Hisar's economy? Possibly. During the second millennium BC, Central Asia and northeastern Iran were experiencing major cultural transformations. Communities associated with the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex were changing, while new populations and networks appeared across the steppe and Iranian plateau. The world around Tepe Hisar was therefore not static. People were moving. Goods were moving. Ideas were moving. And political influence was shifting. Perhaps Tepe Hisar was caught in the middle of this transformation. There is also the question of conflict. Some archaeological interpretations have considered whether destruction or disruption could have contributed to the settlement's decline. But there is no universally accepted evidence for a single invasion that destroyed Tepe Hisar. This is another reason the mystery remains. If an enemy army had destroyed the settlement, archaeologists might expect a clear destruction layer, weapons concentrated in particular areas, burned structures, or other evidence of violent termination. Instead, the site's history appears more complicated. There are changes and disruptions, but no simple archaeological signature of conquest that explains everything. Could the decline therefore have been caused by several pressures acting together? This possibility may be more convincing. Imagine a settlement dependent on agriculture, trade, and skilled craft production. A gradual environmental shift reduces agricultural reliability. At the same time, regional trade routes begin moving elsewhere. Metal supplies become more difficult to obtain. Nearby communities become more competitive. None of these developments alone is fatal. Together, they could change the economic balance. People begin leaving. Workshops close. Buildings are abandoned. And eventually, a settlement that once seemed permanent becomes a place of the past. There is another intriguing possibility. Perhaps Tepe-Hisar did not truly collapse in the conventional sense. Perhaps its population moved. This distinction is crucial. Archaeologists often describe a site as abandoned when the archaeological evidence shows that intensive occupation ended. But the people may simply have relocated to another settlement. They could have followed water sources. They could have moved toward more productive agricultural land. They could have joined communities along new trade routes. Their descendants may have continued living nearby without preserving the exact cultural practices that archaeologists use to identify Tepe-Hisar's earlier inhabitants. In that sense, the settlement could have died while the population survived. The surrounding region contains other archaeological sites, and the movement of people between them remains an important subject of research. But the exact destination of Tepe-Hisar's inhabitants remains difficult to establish. There is no surviving account describing a final migration. No royal inscription announces the end. No written chronicle records the moment when the last residents departed. The mound simply becomes quieter in the archaeological record. And then another mystery appears. Why did Tepe-Hisar matter for so long in the first place? Its endurance suggests that the location offered advantages that were significant enough to sustain occupation through multiple cultural periods. Perhaps its position between different ecological zones made it valuable. Perhaps it controlled access to mountain resources. Perhaps its inhabitants became specialists in crafts that connected them to distant markets. Or perhaps its importance was rooted in social and religious traditions that we can no longer reconstruct. Every archaeological layer reveals part of the answer, but each layer also hides another. The graves at Tepe-Hisar provide glimpses of personal identity and burial customs. The pottery reveals changing artistic traditions. The metal objects reveal technological knowledge. The architecture shows how people organized their living spaces. Yet none explains the final transformation. Today, Tepe-Hisar is silent beneath the northern Iranian sky. The settlement that once contained homes, workshops, and human voices has been reduced to archaeological layers. Its decline was probably not the result of one spectacular disaster. More likely, it emerged from a combination of environmental, economic, political, and social changes unfolding over time. But uncertainty remains. Was water becoming less reliable? Did changing trade routes weaken the settlement? Did new populations and political networks alter the balance of power? Did metalworking and economic specialization become less sustainable? Or did the people of Tepe-Hisar simply decide that another place offered better opportunities? Perhaps future excavations will reveal a neighboring settlement filled with objects carried away from Tepe-Hisar, providing the missing link between the abandoned mound and the communities that followed. Until then, the mound preserves a quiet contradiction. It tells us that people lived here for centuries, yet gives us no clear explanation for why they eventually left. And as the Alborz Mountains stand beyond the ancient settlement, one question remains buried beneath the layers of earth. Did Tepe-Hisar truly meet its end? Or did its people simply carry their lives, their skills, and their memories somewhere beyond the horizon, leaving only the empty mound behind? Across the broad grasslands north of the Caspian Sea, the land seems almost motionless. The horizon stretches without interruption, broken only by low hills, shallow valleys, and the occasional rise of an ancient burial mound. Beneath these quiet mounds, archaeologists have discovered traces of people who lived on the Eurasian steppe more than 3,000 years ago. They left behind pottery, bronze weapons, animal remains, burial chambers, and, in some graves, evidence of horses and a society deeply connected to mobility. These people are associated with what archaeologists call the Potopovka culture, a Bronze Age tradition that developed in the Volga-Ural region during the 2nd millennium BC. Potopovka is not remembered because it built enormous cities or left behind written chronicles. Its importance comes from what its graves reveal. They preserve fragments of a world in transition, a world where pastoral communities were becoming increasingly connected to long-distance networks, where horses were gaining greater importance, and where technologies and traditions inherited from earlier Sintashta-related societies were being transformed. And then, the archaeological signature of Potopovka gradually fades. The people did not necessarily vanish. The culture did. But why? The answer begins with geography. The Potopovka communities occupied a landscape dominated by grassland, rivers, seasonal pasture, and long-distance movement. Agriculture was possible in some regions, but pastoralism was central to the economy. This way of life offered flexibility. If pasture conditions changed, herders could move. If one water source became unreliable, they could seek another. But mobility also had limits. Herds require water. Animals require pasture. And prolonged environmental stress can affect an entire community. Climate change is therefore one possible explanation for the transformations that affected Potopovka and related steppe cultures. But climate alone is unlikely to tell the whole story. The 2nd millennium BC was a period of major cultural change across the Eurasian steppe. The Sintashta tradition had already developed highly sophisticated metalworking and chariot technology farther east. Related communities spread into new regions. The Andronovo cultural horizon emerged across large parts of Central Asia and the steppe. Local traditions interacted with incoming influences. The result was not a single unified civilization, but a constantly changing network of communities. Potopovka existed within this wider transformation. Its people were not isolated. They exchanged objects and ideas with neighboring populations. They inherited traditions from earlier steppe societies, and they contributed traditions of their own. The burial record is particularly revealing. Potopovka graves sometimes contain bronze weapons, pottery, ornaments, animal remains, and evidence associated with horses. These objects suggest that social identity may have been closely connected to pastoralism, mobility, and martial status. But what did the weapons actually mean? Were they used in warfare? Were they symbols of authority? Did they belong to elite individuals? Or were weapons placed in graves because they represented an idealized identity rather than an individual's everyday occupation? The answer remains uncertain. Yet, the repeated association between weapons, horses, and high-status burials suggests that the social structure of these communities was changing. Perhaps individuals who controlled animals, metal goods, and mobility were becoming increasingly influential. Perhaps competition between communities was intensifying. Or perhaps these objects represented ritual traditions that had little to do with actual warfare. The steppe gives us few written clues. We are left with patterns. And patterns can be interpreted in different ways. One possibility is that Potopovka communities gradually became absorbed into larger cultural networks. Instead of disappearing, they may have adopted new pottery styles, burial practices, technologies, and social traditions. If so, the end of Potopovka would have been a transformation of identity rather than a biological disappearance of its population. This process is common in archaeology. A cultural label exists because archaeologists recognize recurring material patterns. When those patterns change, the label ends. But people rarely disappear simply because their pottery changes. Families continue. Communities move. Languages shift. Marriage networks expand. And traditions are modified. The Potopovka people may therefore have become part of the cultures that followed them. The emergence of the broader Andronovo horizon is important here. Across the steppe in Central Asia, related traditions became increasingly widespread. Some archaeological similarities suggest cultural connections, while genetic and isotopic evidence from various regions indicates that populations were moving and mixing across enormous distances. But migration does not necessarily mean invasion. A small community can move. A group of herders can establish itself in a new valley. A marriage network can connect distant communities. A skilled metalworker can travel hundreds of kilometers. Over generations, these small movements can produce major cultural change. Perhaps Potopovka was transformed through exactly this kind of gradual interaction. But another possibility remains: competition. The Eurasian steppe was not an unlimited resource. Pasture was seasonal. Water was essential. Herds could be lost, and neighboring communities could compete for the same territories. If population increased while environmental resources became less predictable, tensions could have grown. In such an environment, mobility itself could become a form of power. Communities with larger herds, better horses, or more effective weapons might have gained advantages over their neighbors. This could have contributed to the development of increasingly hierarchical societies. Yet, there is no clear archaeological evidence showing that a single, devastating war destroyed the Potopovka culture. No final battlefield has been discovered. No ancient record describes an invading army. No single destruction layer explains its disappearance. The decline, therefore, seems more likely to have been gradual. Perhaps environmental pressure weakened some communities. Others migrated. Some adopted new traditions. Others merged with neighboring populations. Over time, the archaeological identity of Potopovka became harder to recognize. There is another fascinating possibility. The transformation may have been driven by changes in long-distance networks. Bronze production depended upon access to copper and tin. Neither resource was necessarily available everywhere. Communities had to maintain exchange relationships. If political conditions changed or trade routes shifted, metal production could become more difficult. The same applied to other prestige goods. A society that had once occupied an important position in a regional exchange network could lose that advantage when routes moved elsewhere. For pastoral communities, these networks may have connected not only goods, but information. Technologies could spread. New weapons could appear. Horse management practices could change. Ritual traditions could travel across vast distances. The steppe was therefore not empty space. It was a communication system, and Potopovka was part of it. Perhaps its decline was simply the result of becoming absorbed into a more extensive cultural world. Or perhaps environmental and social pressures forced communities to reorganize. There are even more speculative possibilities. Could disease have affected herds or human populations? Could sudden changes in climate have caused severe pasture shortages? Could violent conflict have accelerated a transformation that had already begun? Such explanations remain possible, but evidence for any single catastrophic event is insufficient. The most cautious interpretation is that Potopovka changed as part of the larger transformation of the Bronze Age steppe. Its people inherited traditions from earlier societies. They developed their own customs. They interacted with neighboring communities. And eventually, their distinctive material culture gave way to new combinations. The graves remain as the strongest evidence. Under the earth, individuals were buried with objects that expressed identity, wealth, occupation, or belief. Some carried weapons into death. Others were accompanied by vessels and ornaments. Animals sometimes formed part of the ritual. These burials provide a glimpse into a society that left no written explanation for its own transformation. Today, the landscape appears almost indifferent to what happened here. Grass grows where ancient camps once stood. The wind crosses the burial mounds. The rivers continue their slow movement across the steppe. And beneath the soil, the remains of Potopovka communities wait in silence. Were they displaced by environmental change? Did new populations arrive? Did the Potopovka people migrate and merge into successor cultures? Or did their identity simply evolve until archaeologists could no longer recognize it? Perhaps future discoveries will connect a Potopovka burial to a later settlement, revealing where its people went. Perhaps ancient DNA, environmental reconstruction, or another undiscovered cemetery will clarify the sequence of events. Until then, the disappearance of Potopovka remains less like a vanished civilization and more like a fading footprint. The people may have continued. Across the vast grasslands stretching from the southern Urals toward Kazakhstan and deep into Central Asia, the landscape seems almost without boundaries. Rivers cut through open plains. Dry steppe gives way to mountain valleys. Ancient burial mounds rise gently above the grass, while scattered traces of settlements disappear into the soil. More than 3,000 years ago, this enormous region belonged to a cultural world that archaeologists now call the Andronovo Horizon. It was never a single empire. There was no capital controlling the entire steppe. Instead, the Andronovo world consisted of related communities spread across an immense territory, sharing certain technologies, pottery traditions, burial customs, and economic practices while adapting them to very different environments. For centuries, these communities flourished. They raised livestock. They cultivated crops where conditions allowed. They worked bronze. They traveled with horses, and they maintained networks extending across thousands of kilometers. Then, gradually, the world changed. The Andronovo tradition did not simply disappear. It transformed into new regional cultures, and the reasons for that transformation remain one of the more complicated mysteries of Bronze Age Central Asia. The story begins with the steppe itself. The environment was demanding, but it offered enormous opportunities to communities capable of moving between pastures. Herd animals provided food, materials, and wealth. Horses increased mobility, metal tools improved production, and long-distance exchange connected communities to resources unavailable in their immediate surroundings. The Andronovo Horizon emerged from earlier Bronze Age traditions associated with the Sin-Tashta and related cultures. The connection is visible in technologies, burial customs, metallurgy, and settlement patterns. But by the middle of the second millennium BC, the cultural landscape had become far more extensive. Communities associated with Andronovo traditions occupied territories stretching across northern and central Kazakhstan, parts of southern Siberia, and regions farther south toward the mountains and oases of Central Asia. The scale is extraordinary. How could related cultural practices spread across such enormous distances? One explanation is migration. Pastoral communities are naturally mobile. Families could move with their herds, establishing new settlements and maintaining cultural traditions as they traveled. Small groups could spread technologies and customs without replacing entire populations. Over several centuries, repeated movement could create a remarkably broad cultural horizon. But migration is not the only possibility. Ideas can travel without people. Pottery styles can be copied. Weapons can be traded. Religious practices can spread through contact. Marriage networks can connect distant communities. A metal worker can travel farther than an entire village. The Andronovo world may therefore have been created through a mixture of migration and cultural exchange. Yet something happened around the later Bronze Age that changed the character of this world. Settlements became different. Burial practices changed. Economic systems shifted. New cultural traditions appeared. And in many regions, the older Andronovo pattern became increasingly difficult to recognize. Environmental change may have played a role. The steppe was not climatically stable. Changes in temperature and rainfall could affect grasslands, water availability, and agricultural productivity. For communities dependent heavily upon herding, even relatively modest changes could alter seasonal migration patterns. For settled populations, the consequences could be more severe. A village dependent upon nearby fields and water sources could not simply move its irrigation system overnight. Could increasing aridity have pushed communities toward greater mobility? Possibly. Could shifting pasture conditions have encouraged migration toward river valleys and mountain regions? Perhaps. But the evidence does not support a single climate catastrophe that suddenly destroyed the Andronovo world. Instead, the transformation appears to have occurred gradually and unevenly. Different regions changed at different times. Some settlements continued. Others were abandoned. New communities emerged nearby. This suggests adaptation rather than simple collapse. Another factor was technology. The later Bronze Age witnessed important developments in metallurgy, transportation, and animal management. Communities became increasingly skilled at exploiting the resources of the steppe. But technology can also create competition. Bronze weapons made conflict more effective. Horses increased mobility. Wheeled vehicles allowed goods and people to move farther. Communities that controlled key resources could gain influence. The spread of these technologies may therefore have transformed social structures. Across the vast grasslands stretching from the southern Urals toward Kazakhstan and deep into Central Asia, the landscape seems almost without boundaries. Rivers cut through open plains. Dry steppe gives way to mountain valleys. Ancient burial mounds rise gently above the grass, while scattered traces of settlements disappear into the soil. More than 3,000 years ago, this enormous region belonged to a cultural world that archaeologists now call the Andronovo Horizon. It was never a single empire. There was no capital controlling the entire steppe. Instead, the Andronovo world consisted of related communities spread across an immense territory, sharing certain technologies, pottery traditions, burial customs, and economic practices while adapting them to very different environments. For centuries, these communities flourished. They raised livestock. They cultivated crops where conditions allowed. They worked bronze. They traveled with horses. And they maintained networks extending across thousands of kilometers. Then, gradually, the world changed. The Andronovo tradition did not simply disappear. It transformed into new regional cultures, and the reasons for that transformation remain one of the more complicated mysteries of Bronze Age Central Asia. The story begins with the steppe itself. The environment was demanding, but it offered enormous opportunities to communities capable of moving between pastures. Herd animals provided food, materials, and wealth. Horses increased mobility. Metal tools improved production. And long-distance exchange connected communities to resources unavailable in their immediate surroundings. The Andronovo Horizon emerged from earlier Bronze Age traditions associated with the Sin-Tashta and related cultures. The connection is visible in technologies, burial customs, metallurgy, and settlement patterns. But by the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, the cultural landscape had become far more extensive. Communities associated with Andronovo traditions occupied territories stretching across northern and central Kazakhstan, parts of southern Siberia, and regions farther south toward the mountains and oases of Central Asia. The scale is extraordinary. How could related cultural practices spread across such enormous distances? One explanation is migration. Pastoral communities are naturally mobile. Families could move with their herds, establishing new settlements and maintaining cultural traditions as they traveled. Small groups could spread technologies and customs without replacing entire populations. Over several centuries, repeated movement could create a remarkably broad cultural horizon. But migration is not the only possibility. Ideas can travel without people. Pottery styles can be copied. Weapons can be traded. Religious practices can spread through contact. Marriage networks can connect distant communities. A metal worker can travel farther than an entire village. The Andronovo world may therefore have been created through a mixture of migration and cultural exchange. Yet something happened around the later Bronze Age that changed the character of this world. Settlements became different. Burial practices changed. Economic systems shifted. New cultural traditions appeared. And in many regions, the older Andronovo pattern became increasingly difficult to recognize. Environmental change may have played a role. The steppe was not climatically stable. Changes in temperature and rainfall could affect grasslands, water availability, and agricultural productivity. For communities dependent heavily upon herding, even relatively modest changes could alter seasonal migration patterns. For settled populations, the consequences could be more severe. A village dependent upon nearby fields and water sources could not simply move its irrigation system overnight. Could increasing aridity have pushed communities toward greater mobility? Possibly. Could shifting pasture conditions have encouraged migration toward river valleys and mountain regions? Perhaps. But the evidence does not support a single climate catastrophe that suddenly destroyed the Andronovo world. Instead, the transformation appears to have occurred gradually and unevenly. Different regions changed at different times. Some settlements continued. Others were abandoned. New communities emerged nearby. This suggests adaptation rather than simple collapse. Another factor was technology. The later Bronze Age witnessed important developments in metallurgy, transportation, and animal management. Communities became increasingly skilled at exploiting the resources of the steppe. But technology can also create competition. Bronze weapons made conflict more effective. Horses increased mobility. Wheeled vehicles allowed goods and people to move farther. Communities that controlled key resources could gain influence. The spread of these technologies may therefore have transformed social structures. Along the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, where fields and waterways once formed one of the richest agricultural landscapes of ancient Egypt, the remains of Tel el-Daba lie beneath layers of soil. Today, the site is quiet, surrounded by cultivated land and modern settlements. But more than 3,000 years ago, this was Avaris, the great center of the Hyksos rulers and one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Its streets were filled with people from different cultural backgrounds. Homes stood beside workshops. Temples rose above neighborhoods. Ships and merchants moved through waterways connected to the Mediterranean and the Near East. And then, during the final phase of Hyksos rule, something changed. The settlement experienced destruction. Buildings were damaged. Some areas were abandoned. And eventually the Hyksos political order disappeared. The obvious explanation is conquest. Egyptian forces under the rulers of the late 17th dynasty fought to expel the Hyksos from northern Egypt, and the campaigns of Kamosi and Amosi are recorded in Egyptian sources. By the time Amosi I captured Avaris, Hyksos' power had collapsed, and Egypt's new kingdom was beginning. But the archaeological evidence at Tel el-Daba tells a more complicated story. It does not resemble a single moment of destruction across the entire city. Different areas show different forms of damage and abandonment. Some buildings were burned, others were dismantled. Some neighborhoods appear to have been gradually deserted, and this raises a question that has never completely disappeared from the archaeology. What actually happened to the city at the end of Hyksos' rule? The first clue lies in the nature of Avaris itself. The city was not simply an Egyptian settlement ruled by foreign kings. Its population appears to have included communities with strong connections to the Levant, alongside Egyptians and people from other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. The architecture reflects this diversity. Burial customs show unusual traditions. Objects found at the site demonstrate extensive contacts with the Levant and wider Mediterranean world. Avaris was therefore a city where cultures overlapped, and that makes its destruction especially difficult to interpret. When Egyptian armies eventually conquered the city, were they destroying an enemy capital, or were they fighting for control of a multicultural commercial center that had become politically independent from the Egyptian state? The distinction matters. The Hyksos rulers had controlled northern Egypt for generations. Their kingdom was centered around the eastern delta, but their influence extended beyond Egypt through connections with the Levant. The city was strategically positioned near routes leading toward Asia. It also benefited from access to the Nile's waterways. Whoever controlled Avaris controlled an important gateway between Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. That made conflict almost inevitable once Egyptian rulers began attempting to reunify the country. The archaeological evidence does indicate violent disruption around the end of the Hyksos period, but the details remain uncertain. Some areas show signs of fire and destruction. Elsewhere, evidence suggests abandonment rather than catastrophic destruction. Could this reflect several military campaigns rather than one final assault? Possibly. The Egyptian war against the Hyksos was not necessarily a single battle. It appears to have unfolded over years. Kamase launched campaigns against Hyksos-controlled territory before Ahmose eventually completed the conquest. The city may therefore have experienced repeated instability before its final political collapse. Another possibility is that parts of Avaris were abandoned before the final Egyptian conquest. If economic conditions had changed, if trade routes had shifted, or if political pressure had intensified, some residents may have left gradually. The city could have been weakening even before Egyptian forces entered, but the evidence does not allow us to reconstruct the sequence with certainty. This uncertainty becomes particularly interesting when we examine the human remains. At Tel el-Daba, archaeological evidence has revealed burials and remains that have been interpreted in different ways. Some evidence has been discussed in relation to violent death, though interpreting skeletal trauma is notoriously difficult. A wound does not necessarily prove a battle. It could result from an accident. It could occur during interpersonal violence. It could happen during warfare. Context is everything, and the context at Avaris remains complex. The destruction of a city can also have consequences long after the fighting ends. Buildings may be abandoned. Valuable objects may be removed. Temples may be dismantled. Walls may be rebuilt. New rulers may deliberately erase signs of the previous regime. This is especially important in the case of the Hyksos. Later Egyptian tradition portrayed the Hyksos as foreign rulers who had occupied Egypt and were eventually expelled. The memory of their rule became part of a larger narrative of restoration, but archaeological evidence suggests that the Hyksos were not simply outsiders who suddenly appeared. Their communities had been present in the eastern delta for generations. They had adopted aspects of Egyptian culture while preserving traditions from the Levant. Their rulers used Egyptian royal titles and participated in Egyptian religious practices. The city itself was deeply Egyptian and Levantine at the same time. So, when Egyptian forces conquered Avaris, they were not destroying a completely foreign civilization. They were dismantling a political regime embedded within Egyptian society. That may explain why the physical destruction of the city was uneven. Some buildings were destroyed. Others were reused. Some areas continued to be occupied. And eventually, Avaris was transformed. The new rulers did not necessarily want to erase the entire settlement. They wanted control of it. This pattern can be seen elsewhere in history. Conquerors often destroy symbols of political power while preserving infrastructure that remains useful. A palace can be dismantled while a harbor continues operating. A temple can be transformed while homes remain occupied. A city can change rulers without losing its population entirely. Could this have happened at Tel el-Dabba? Very likely. But there is another mystery. Where did the Hyksos population go? The royal dynasty disappeared. The political center collapsed. But the people who had lived there did not simply vanish. Some may have remained in Egypt. Others may have moved into the Levant. Some may have joined communities farther north. The archaeological record cannot yet identify a single destination for the displaced population. Perhaps the conquest scattered them across several regions. Perhaps many simply continued living under Egyptian rule. The later history of the Eastern Delta suggests that the region remained culturally connected to the Levant even after the Hyksos period. The population had not been erased. Its political identity had changed. This is one reason the destruction of Tel el-Dabba should not be understood only as a military event. It was also a transformation of identity. The city that had once represented Hyksos power became part of the Egyptian New Kingdom. Its architecture was altered. Its political significance changed. New institutions appeared, and the old order gradually became memory. Yet the archaeological evidence still contains puzzles. Why were some structures burned while others were abandoned? How long did the destruction process actually last? Did fighting occur within the city itself, or were some buildings destroyed after the political conquest? Were some residents killed while others fled? And how much of the destruction resulted from warfare rather than deliberate dismantling by the new rulers? There is no single answer. Even the famous image of Everest falling beneath Egyptian armies may conceal a much slower and more complicated process. Perhaps the city endured several stages of conflict. Perhaps political instability caused residents to leave before the final conquest. Perhaps the Egyptians deliberately destroyed selected buildings associated with Hyksos authority. Or perhaps some of the damage came from events that had nothing to do with the final war. The soil keeps its secrets. Today, the remains of Tel el-Dabba lie beneath a landscape that has been reshaped by thousands of years of agriculture and settlement. But beneath that landscape, the final chapters of Avaris remain preserved in fragments. Burned walls, broken objects, abandoned buildings, burials, and traces of a population whose origins were already mixed long before the city fell. The Hyksos kingdom eventually disappeared. The Egyptian state regained control of the delta. A new imperial age began. But the people of Avaris were not erased from history so easily. Some likely remained. Others may have moved away, and their cultural traditions may have continued beyond the political boundaries that had once defined them. Perhaps future excavations will reveal exactly how the final destruction unfolded. Perhaps another building will provide evidence of a final battle. Perhaps a forgotten cemetery will reveal where displaced residents went. Or perhaps the evidence will continue to suggest something more complicated. A city that was not destroyed in one dramatic instant, but gradually transformed as one political world gave way to another.